School Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. And I warned Trump that the humiliation would come playing with Putin. Now he's begging Putin all over social media. Please don't kill these people. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means you hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Let's get into the content. Exactly what is going on. Why is Trump begging Putin? And is he actually begging him?
To breaking news now, and US President Donald Trump has taken to social media following his meeting with Russia's president. Posting to his social media platform, Truth Social, Mr. Trump says, "We had a very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there is a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one not seen since World War II.
Yes, it would be a horrible massacre if those NATO Nazis don't surrender, Mr. Trump. Putin has already said, hey, he's willing to spare their lives if they surrender. They committed a bunch of terroristic crimes over there. They've been considered terrorists. But these aren't just Ukrainians. These are NATO. Ukraine and the EU is very upset about Trump saying this. They're pretending like there's nobody surrounded. They wanted Putin to just kill these people. Let's pretend like they didn't. We don't know where they at. Keep sending us money for them. They're upset with Trump about telling the truth. Thousands of troops are surrounded, like Putin said it was. Well, how would Trump know this? He has satellite intelligence, the same intelligence they said they needed to defeat the Russians. But they pretend like this not true.
God bless them all.
Let's get into that part. Europe is pretending like Trump is making this up. Why is he saying what Putin was saying? Why is he telling the truth? Peace and blessings, salute. But I told Trump, by acting tough for Putin, it wasn't going to work. Now you have to beg Putin. And that's what he did. He went to social media and begged them. What's he trying to save? NATO. He don't give a damn about the Nazis. He trying to save some U.S. intelligence officers that's trapped. That's who he trying to save.
It is the matter of what Moscow wants. This was Steve Witkoff, the Trump envoy, who'd gone to talk ceasefire with Vladimir Putin. The debrief was delivered by his Secretary of State at a meeting of the G7 in Canada.
I think there is reason to be cautiously optimistic, but by the same token, we continue to recognize this is a difficult and complex situation. It will not be easy, it will not be simple, but we certainly feel like we're at least some steps closer to ending this war and bringing peace, but it's still a long journey.
Amidst talk of a ceasefire, this is the picture on the ground. Russia continues to advance in the Kursk region, but there's dispute over the circumstances of Ukrainian soldiers. Putin has said they're surrounded. The Ukrainians insist they're not. Donald Trump has taken the Russian line.
Now, Ukraine always say they're not surrounded or they didn't lose territory until months later. Ukraine, they don't want the people to know what type of disaster just happened, the biggest disaster collapse since World War II. But this is the important part. Now they're coming out and saying, because Trump came out on his social media and begged Putin to spare these thousands of troops that's trapped. Now they're saying, why is Trump repeating Putin talking points? First of all, Trump got the satellite photos. The same intelligence reports that they've been yelling they needed from Trump. Why is Trump taking this from them? Well, Trump came out and told the truth. Well, thousands of troops is trapped. Some of them NATO. Please spare them. They upset.
We should have never let this war happen. First of all, you don't want to pick on somebody that's a lot larger than you, even with the money. There's a lot of money that we gave them and a lot of equipment. It's unbelievable. Right now, you have a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that are encircled and in grave danger. And I've asked them not to kill those soldiers, please, not to kill those soldiers. We don't want them killed.
It was a plea to the aggressor in Moscow, for whom everything is a negotiation.
I would like to emphasize that if they lay down their arms and surrender, they will be guaranteed life and decent treatment in accordance with the norms of international law and the laws of the Russian Federation.
On the night Trump's envoy visited Moscow, so did Ukrainian attack drones, brought down by Russian air defenses, but not before they damaged apartment blocks. As Ukraine's president was handing out war medals, Donald Trump spoke of a very good chance the war could end. But Ukrainian concerns are compounded by Russia's stance on a ceasefire, still some way off.
It is still crucial to pressure Russia into being constructive, to put an end to all these Russian manipulations that could only prolong the war.
On the day the US president was making requests of Russia, G7 ministers delivered a warning.
Now is the time for a ceasefire with no conditions. Ukraine has set their position out. It is now for Russia to accept it.
The G7 warned Russia if it didn't back a ceasefire in Ukraine, it would face further sanctions. In content and tone, it was a message much stronger than Trump's.
A message much stronger. While thousands of troops is surrounded, they decided to go on TV and talk tough. You see? They say their message is way stronger than Trump's message. Trump's message is not strong enough.
Have unfolded this week, to watch the fact that while all of the Western world, specifically the Trump administration, some of their allies, maybe not so allies in Europe, were watching and waiting for Putin to turn down the ceasefire offer, right? For him to say, no, we will not do a 30-day ceasefire. Technically, he didn't say that. He said they'd love to have a ceasefire, but there are a lot of different preconditions we have to talk about first, and rightfully so. This is a very complicated conflict. We don't get to just pause it overnight. Oh, and if there is a pause, we need to talk about what Kiev is going to be up to for those 30 days, a conversation that the West doesn't exactly want to have, because I'm sure that they have plenty of plans for Kiev, which also include the latest escalations on behalf of the Trump administration and the things they are doing behind the scenes related to sanctions against Russia and weapons deliveries for Ukraine that are kind of being quietly mentioned in the media. We got into all of the latest with the special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, it has been quite a busy week this week, so I'm looking forward to getting into all of the latest with you. And I want to start off with what we heard from Russian President Putin, because he responded publicly for the first time on Thursday to this U.S. proposal for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. And he didn't give it an outright no, but he kind of gave a very diplomatic version of a no, noting that Russia is all for resolving the conflict peacefully. And he then went on to note all of the different preconditions that would be needed for an agreement to be made. So how do you view his response? Was that about what you expected?
Are you familiar with the African-American comedic duo from the United States, Key and Peele?
I am, yes.
Yes. Okay, so I think they're funny. They used to have a show together on Comedy Central, I believe, and there was a couple of skits that involved President Obama's anger management translator, where Obama would say one thing, and then the translator would translate it into real person speak, right? So Putin, thanked Trump effusively for his, service, his attention, and doing what he can to bring the conflict to an end, and says it's a great idea. He's fully behind the idea of a ceasefire. And he just has a few questions, just some questions, right? Let me see if I can be Putin's anger management translator. Hey, you con artist real estate fuck. Not only no, but hell no. Right? That's what Putin actually said, right? Of course, he didn't say it that way. He started raising questions about the first of all, he said the first thing is there are now several thousand Kiev regime troops that invaded Kursk who are now completely surrounded, and many of them have they've been involved. This isn't being reported in the Western media at all, of course, but they've been involved in lots of war crimes against the civilian population. They were killing in a lot of these places. They were just killing all men. Some places they killed women and so forth. And they're compiling lots of evidence. And I've seen enough of it to be satisfied that it was more than an occasional. So there might be hundreds of dead. But he said, what are we supposed to do? Just let them go? Should we just, let them go after they've committed all these crimes? And then he raised also questions, and what's to be done during these 30 days, right? Is the Kiev regime going to continue their mass forced conscription, right? Are they going to continue to receive armaments from the West? Is martial law in Ukraine going to continue? And then this is a huge contact line. Who's going to monitor it? How will it be enforced, right? All of the basic things. And what he said, let me turn on anger management translator mode. You American idiots really don't know what you're doing with this. You present me with this half-baked shit, right? Pass it off as a real ceasefire plan. When was the last time you guys actually did any diplomacy, right? That's what it was. And we had more upfront and frank comments earlier in the day from Yuri Ushakov, whom is Putin's top and very close foreign policy advisor, who, by the way, represented Russia in Riyadh, kind of the rough equivalent of Mike Waltz as the national security advisor. And Lavrov also made some comments, and they clearly reiterated once again that Russia's not interested in any ceasefire, that they're only interested in it if it's part of a long range settlement. And they reiterated the conditions in detail that Putin laid out already last June. Of what Russia would require for a ceasefire, including the Kiev regime withdrawing all of their troops from what they have left in the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and a public commitment that they intended to change return their constitution to what it was before the West-backed Maidan Putsch in 2014, where neutrality was enshrined in their constitution and a few other conditions as well before Russia would consider a ceasefire. So what Putin is doing is he could tell. I mean, you saw the statements from Trump, and you saw that every Western leader, like parrots, squawked and repeated the same thing. The ball's now in Russia's court. The ball's now in Russia's court. The ball's now in Russia's court, right? You heard this from every European leader, playing their role. A week ago, they were all warmongering and a war summit. We're going to spend $850 billion on weapons, and we're going to rearm Europe, and we're going to retake Ukraine. And the prime minister of Denmark said, war is better than peace. And this was, now it's all like, yeah, ceasefire is a great idea. They all got in line behind this because they saw this presented as an opportunity, right, to present Russia, when they inevitably said no, as the obstacle to peace. And then the pressure on some of Russia's trading allies. China wouldn't care. But on probably India and Brazil and other countries that might be more susceptible, saying, look, okay, what Biden did was Biden, but we want to end this war. Can you please help us? Blah, blah, blah. And, go through this whole, diplomatic pillaring of Russia as the one who doesn't want peace. Well, Putin has deflected that, if you want to say, bounced the ball back into the Western court by saying, yes, a ceasefire is a great idea. We just need some discussion and guarantee. See, here's the problem, is you worked this all out with Ukraine beforehand, and you didn't even talk to us. And we have, some constructive questions about how this, and basically they're saying, they're pointing out the absolute impossibility of this ceasefire, right? They're pointing out how ridiculous the at least the ceasefire on paper that Trump was presented in the media. If there's more to it that Witikoff presented to Putin, obviously that didn't convince him later in the evening either. So right now Russia is playing a game. What they're trying to do is they're saying, yes, we're saying no to a ceasefire. But what they're doing is trying to use that discussion, like, okay, well, let's talk about a ceasefire and draw the Trump administration into real negotiations of substance on a final settlement of the Ukraine issue. Now, whether that will work or not, no, I mean, ultimately, I don't believe that settlement is possible, that it will have to be finished on the battlefield. But Russia, even in that case, is interested in the talks as improving U.S.-Russian bilateral relations, because it is wrong that the two biggest nuclear armed countries in the world haven't talked to each other for 3 years. And also, I think there's a little bit of mischief there, because the Europeans go absolutely apoplectic every time Trump talks to Putin. So they're helping exacerbate tensions. I think Putin is by being willing to talk to Trump. And Trump keeps saying he wants to talk to Putin. He wants to meet with him. Now, the Russian side has previously said, well, there's a lot of groundwork that has to be done. Like, things have to be set up, right? We can't just meet and, hash this out like it's a New York real estate deal. This is high diplomacy and geopolitics. And the leaders meet at the end when something is actually agreed on. But Trump seems to be under the illusion that, we can just meet and we'll do this alpha dog hand dog shake where I'll try to break his arm and then he'll roll over and agree to whatever I say, like he does with Macron or Zelensky or anyone else. In fact, that whole scenario, that whole fracas in the White House a week ago, we heard from no less than Caroline Leavitt, Trump's spokeswoman, that the way they see it, the whole withdrawing of military and intelligence, supposedly for a few days, was simply to put Zelensky in his place, and that's what they did. Zelensky rolled over, showed his belly, and properly submitted to the alpha dog. Right now, he's in line, and he agreed to the ceasefire. And the goal, again, all of it was to paint Russia as saying no as the obstacle to peace. And if Russia really did say yes, well, then they'd have 30 days to rearm and for the Kiev regime to conscript and train up more troops and recover from the crumbling of their some of their best military forces in Kursk and the surrounding of several more up there and other problems all along most of the front line. That's the situation as it stands with the ceasefire right now. Russia is not going to agree to a ceasefire, but they're not going to come out and say it. They're going to simply make clear that it is impossible while trying to draw the Trump administration into further talks.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the way that Putin started out with those comments, because I saw multiple headlines that were like, Putin agrees to a ceasefire, right? As if they just listened to the first 30 seconds.
Did that. RT did that.
Of like what he had to say.
No.
And I go, wait a second, he did? And then I get on and I listen to the full 7-8 minutes of what he had to say specifically on that topic. And exactly as you noted there, he's like, yeah, sure, we'd love to end this conflict through a peaceful means, but let's talk about what that actually looks like, right? We can't just decide, like Rubio's dream of of we have a ceasefire with no preconditions is not remotely realistic when you're talking about how long this contact line is, the situation in Kursk, and everything else that plays into it. And the really important point that Putin brought up there was, okay, let's say we come to this agreement, who's going to enforce it? Because that's been the thing that they've run up against time and time again with the Minsk Accords, is that we have this nice shiny agreement and then no one is there to enforce it when Russia is saying, hey, Kiev is violating this over and over again.
Yeah, Russia's certainly not going to accept troops from any NATO member state on the ground. And then if not then, right, then who would, I really can't see Chinese troops or Indian troops deployed in Ukraine between Kiev regime forces and Russia. And ultimately, let's be frank, the only foreign troops that are going to be in Ukraine are Russian troops. Right? That's the way that this is going to end, right? There's not going to be allowed to be any other troops, right? Unless you want to count the fictional, I can see North Korean.
I was going to say, what about the North Koreans? They've made a comeback.
They're still playing. Yeah, they all went home. They were all defeated and they all ran away, and now they're all back again, and still not a whit of real evidence. And I'm just amazed that the Western media continues this charade. It's very, very damning and embarrassing, and it's one of the clearest indications of what just propaganda devices they've become.
Yeah, and it's like it's almost lost its weight at this point, right? They've repeated North Korean troops in Kursk so often that people are just kind of like, okay, what are we supposed to think about that, I guess? Now, I do want to ask you about the situation in the Kursk region, because we've seen some major Russian advances there, to the extent that Putin sat there and said, hey, Russia now has complete control of this region, and that the remaining Ukrainian forces there are encircled and isolated. So will you take us through where things stand in Kursk? I know we've been kind of talking about it in recent weeks, building up to this point, but what do you make of the timing of everything that happened this week?
Okay, so Russia has long been using the Kursk incursion zone, which already by a couple months ago had shrunk down to, you can talk to it more accurately as the Suja pocket. And Suja is the largest urban center, town. You'd be generous to call it a town. It had 4,000 to 5,000 people. This is what a wooded backwater this Kursk region was, that the largest settlement that the Kiev regime managed to tank, and so became the center of their occupation, was 4,000 to 5,000 people. That was it, right? Which really points out the problem, because they didn't have anywhere to put troops, to hide them from artillery, from drones, equipment. Where do you hide that? It was a real bad situation for them. It started in August when the leaves were already starting to change. Then they all fell off, which made it hard to hide stuff in the forest too. It was really bad. So it had shrunk already up to about 2 months ago to really just a pocket around Suja, a lifeline coming up through Russian territory, through the N07 highway. And that was it. And about 2 months ago, Russia said, all right, we've gotten enough out of this fire bag. We've attrited so much equipment, they don't really have much left. And there's political stuff coming up. Let's roll this up. And they started shrinking, but also moving down on both sides of the pocket to cut off the supply lines to that Suja, where Zelensky kept throwing reinforcements after reinforcements, men and equipment, because he just couldn't give this up, because he had so much politically invested in it. And it didn't help. Russia slowly tightened that noose over 2 months. And they even crossed the border into the Ukrainian side and started building a bridgehead in Sumi region, right? Where they still are, of course, and now they're going to expand that into a buffer zone. So that set the stage. The noose was nearly tight. this one highway was under complete drone and artillery control. It was a real road of death. The videos of it, I've seen estimates that some 90% of things that they were trying to send up or wounded take away were wiped out trying to get there. So it was completely unsustainable. And they couldn't use anything else because this winter has been crazy climate change in recorded history. Almost all of January was above zero. Then there was a few cold weeks below zero in February. And then after that again, I mean, it shot up to above 10 degrees Celsius, like 10 degrees above the freezing point, which means everything turned to mud, right? That's the Rasputitsa. The mud season came real early. And that means that the Kiev regime couldn't use country, mud roads or off fields to keep Stuja supplied. It all just had to be on this one, not in very good condition road to begin with. And certainly by this point, it was practically impassable. So and then on top of that, Russia had a special forces, a special military operation where for the third time in this conflict, they used a pipeline system to get troops through the Kiev regime's defensive and pop them up in their rear. And in this case, they use the particular gas pipelines that are affiliated. They're not actually part of the Druzhba pipeline network because that's oil, this is gas. But up until January, these pipelines had been full of gas that was still being sent to Europe, in particular Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, that whole region down there. And if you'll remember, Zelensky refused to extend the transit agreement, right? Because he's going to put the screws to, Slovakia and to Russia the way he saw it. Now, he was cutting Ukraine off of the transit fees they were receiving this whole time, but they were perfectly willing to do that. And that's when Russia immediately saw the opportunity there. So that pipeline was shut down. They pumped it out. They pumped what gas was in it out. They filled it full of oxygen. It was 1.4 meters in diameter, which I guess is a little over, it's like 4 feet. And they managed to get, by some estimates from some of those that were involved, some 800 troops that, they put on breathers. They were in there for days waiting for the proper time because it all also had to be arranged so that things were going around them so that, they could properly take advantage of this. And when they popped up behind, evidently it took an hour and a half for the Kiev regime forces to realize what was going on and that the pipeline had been used. And at that point, it was far too late. And when they did start attacking them, all the Kiev regime forces in those to the north of where they popped out. And this was some 15 kilometers, right? Close to 9-10 miles that they transited in this dark. I mean, if you have claustrophobia, don't watch these videos. I'll tell you that. And this is the third time because it happened first in Avdiivka and then in Toretsk, and the Kiev regime doesn't learn their lesson. And ironically enough, in a James Bond movie, The Living Daylights, with Timothy Dalton, Timothy Dalton used this gas pipeline network to get a Russian dissident, a cellist, played by Miriam Diabo. They kind of zoomed through it to get them on the other side into the west in a cleaning pod. That was what it was supposed to be in any way in the film. So even James Bond knew this plan, right? It's pretty ironic there. And the fact that Zelensky shot himself in the foot with this once again. So the Kiev regime forces, they panicked, right? They didn't know what was going on and they were afraid and they panicked. Their morale was already in a very bad situation and tanked, and they just fled. They fled. They tried to save their lives. And Russia was waiting for them to flee. And they set ambushes. There's a video out there of a bunch of Kiev regime forces trying to cross then into what was still Ukraine. Kiev regime held parts of Suja over a bridge, and Russia, this bridge had already been mined by the Kiev regime forces so that they could blow it up if they needed to retreat at some point. Well, Russia knew that and simply sent a drone into it, blew up the bridge. The Ukrainian forces trying to escape in a fairly large convoy came and found that the bridge was no longer there. They tried to back up, going the way over another bridge they had already crossed, and Russia tanked that one too. And then it was just a turkey shoot. If you feel sympathy for them, then it was cruel. By some estimates, the Russian estimates that, and credible estimates, it must be said, 90% of the Kiev regime forces that they had in those positions there in Suja and north of it either surrendered or died. And that's it. They're gone now. And there's still thousands because Russia closed the trap. They've now completely taken Suja, not just the town of Suja, and they took it in fairly good condition. They didn't have to completely destroy it because the Kiev regime is just in full retreat and crumbling at this point. And they took the whole Suja agglomerated area because it was kind of a spread out town. They had, a lot of, if you want to call suburbs of a town, not really hamlets. So all that the Kiev regime has left as of this morning, right, is 4 tiny hamlets right on the border, and Russia's going to steamroll those in no short order. They're not defendable, really. It's certainly not what they're facing. And then Putin already made clear. Putin showed up in the Kursk region to speak to Shoigu, right, and the generals who were in command of this, but also with some of the participants of that pipeline operation. And this was on the eve of the ceasefire announcement by Zelensky and Trump. And Putin showed up for the first time in this entire special military operation in a military uniform. In camos, right? Now, yes, he was close to the front lines and everything, but he's done that before. And occasionally he's put on a camouflage jacket, like right before the special military operation started, but it was still just over his suit and everything. Nope, full military camo fatigues and everything. And that is widely being read as a signal that Russia's not in a ceasefire mood, shall we say, that they're very serious about finishing this point, especially after what they've seen that the Kiev regime forces did to Russian civilians in these small towns and villages in the Kursk region. So the conflict will go on. And the Trump administration already obviously knows that Russia, whatever the words being said, oh, Trump, I want to talk to Putin. It's, he hasn't completely agreed, but, we're talking, and everything. And while all this dance is going on diplomatically, the Trump administration has already put new restrictions on Russian oil, gas, and banking sector. The fine details of what they're doing is that Biden put sanctions on Russia back in January, right before he left office. But there were 60-day exemptions on some Russian banks from these sanctions, basically so that European countries could still get the energy they needed. Well, Trump has now very quietly but very purposefully let that exemption expire without renewing it.
It's not going to hurt
which, well, actually, it's going to be a lot worse for the Europeans than for the Russians. Eventually, Russia will find other buyers in the world for oil. It'll maybe take some time, right? But the Europeans are going to be scrambling because of the distribution to the market. They're going to have to bid on oil that would have been allocated to other countries, right? Pushing the prices of oil for the entire world up, some estimates, $5 a barrel in the next few weeks, right? Again, and which Russian exports will be down for a brief time until they get distribution sorted out and find new buyers. But in the meantime, prices are going to go up. So whatever they are selling, they're going to make more money. This has been the same stupidity with sanctions on Russian commodities through the course of this conflict again and again and again. And they don't seem to get it through their heads that it doesn't really hurt Russia, because Russia has commodities that the world, the global market needs, right? And someone will buy it. They'll get around whatever sanctions. And the other thing is also fairly quietly, the Trump administration is now sending new, improved ground-launched small-diameter bombs. Reuters reported this in the last 24. Supposedly, this new version is going to be more resistant to Russian jamming with electronic warfare. Well, we'll see about that. But this is to replace the ATACMS, which evidently the Kiev regime is completely out of, and they're hoping that these ground-launched small-diameter bombs have a range of about 100 miles, theoretically, and the U.S. should have plenty of them, because it's basically an old dumb bomb that has had rocket propulsion added to it, and it can be used from existing artillery and rocket launch systems. That's the idea behind it anyway. And the first time they sent them, already a year and a half, 2 years ago, Russian electronic warfare jammed them because they're guided to target by GPS. And Russia's electronic warfare has proven extremely effective at rendering any U.S. weapon, smart U.S. weapon, into a useless hunk of metal with their electronic warfare jamming of the GPS signals. Supposedly, these ones will be more electronic warfare resistant. As an article in the Western media, I believe it was the Financial Times and possibly Wall Street Journal, put out already almost a year ago, the U.S.'s high-tech weapons work until they don't. That was the headline, because like the Borg in Star Trek, you got 3 shots with your phasers, and then their shields adapt, and you're out of luck, resistance is futile. Well, Russian electronic warfare has proven very adept at quickly learning new Western systems. And I don't doubt that this will be the same with these new improved ground-launched small-diameter bombs as well. But for those who think that Trump is not escalating, and he's talking about, the poor dead Russians and Ukrainians, and now he's sending new and improved bombs to the Kiev regime. So
yeah, it's very telling there, the responses that we're getting. And it makes me wish that Trump of today would talk to Trump of 2 weeks ago, when he's sitting there with Zelensky and he's telling him Russia's winning this war. Russia holds all of the cards right now, because it seems as though he's forgotten about that. It's a distant memory.
He just said a couple days ago, Putin has no cards.
Yeah.
Zelensky's a dictator.
How's he begging Putin?
A few days later. Did I say that? I don't remember saying that. Right? The man has, when he said that, I'm like, he can't just take that back. And I was wrong, because he just, nope, didn't happen, never repeated. And that's the way the man is. There is no trust, no veracity. He can change on a dime, and probably does every 15 minutes with whoever he talked to less, reverse his position on something. So I think increasingly Russia is already getting frustrated and dealing with him and these contradictions, and the fact that the U.S. really doesn't seem to know, there doesn't seem to be any unity in the administration. There's division, and that there's no plan of how to do this other than, for Trump to play nice with Putin, I guess, and get what they want. Well, that's not what's going to happen. So that Russia will continue trying to make the diplomatic course work. But in the meantime, it's just go on the ground. Yeah,
the more time that goes, I've heard it said, and I think that this is spot on, that time is on Russia's side here, right? They are like, what, sure, we'll keep talking, we'll schedule meetings, whatever you want to do, we'll keep that dialogue going. But then they also keep going on the battlefield, and it'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration does next. I'm very curious to see what their next quote unquote move is here, now that, as you pointed out, they did not exactly get Putin to be in that place of saying, no, we won't do a ceasefire so that they could.
He didn't roll over and show his belly to Trump like Zelensky did. And why would he?
Right. They've got to now figure out how to deal with that moving forward. But as always, I appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break
table with Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern. For Larry and I, it has been a tumultuous and eye-opening week, about which, as we were in Moscow together with others in our group, about which more a little later. But Larry and Ray, I want to ask the same question to each of you, and Larry, to you first. In 1 week, Marco Rubio, the American Secretary of State, claims he has a ceasefire, to which Vladimir Zelensky agrees. President Putin, in my view, profoundly rejected it. You guys may disagree on how profound the rejection was. In the same week, President Trump reopened the spigot of military aid to Kyiv and reopened the spigot of intel to Kyiv. And in the same week, Ukraine bombed residential neighborhoods in Moscow, killing a few people. Larry, to you first. And Ray, I'm going to ask the same question. What the hell is going on?
Ukraine is desperate, and it's lashing out. Actually, they didn't accept the ceasefire, or at least the delegates said, oh, yeah, we're in favor of a ceasefire. But then the very next day, Zelensky walked away from it. So whereas Putin's response was very polite, and nuanced, which has a special meaning apparently in Russian. But he then listed out a variety of things that would have to be addressed, which is exactly what you and I heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov in our discussion on Monday, that the position that Putin laid out about having an end to hostilities last June in 2024 remain in effect. That hasn't changed. And so to top it off, that drone attack that was launched across Russia, I was there for it. I have to honestly say, I didn't hear a thing. I was, we were downtown at the Metropole. There were no air raid warning or alarms going off. There weren't any news flashes across the screen telling people to take cover. So the Russian air defense seemed to have it pretty well handled. Nonetheless, it was still one of those things that was a further evidence, as far as Russia is concerned, that Ukraine is this continuing aggressor. But then Putin followed that up by the next day, dressing in military uniform and combat fatigues, going to Kursk and giving Gerasimov and his commanders the direct order that all Ukrainian military personnel still in Kursk, they have only two choices: surrender or die. He didn't open up any other third avenue.
And on the other thing that happened this week, before we go to Ray, Trump reopening the two spigots, military and intel.
Yeah, I think that's really more symbolic than substantive. It's one of those things that Trump, I think, may be doing to try to deflect pressure from those members of Congress that, frankly, they're on the payroll. I could tell you off air the precise number, but you'd be surprised at the number of Republicans and Democrats that have been getting kickbacks out of the U.S. aid that's been flowing to Ukraine. It's getting kicked back to them.
You mean bribes to them or political donations?
Yes.
All right, Ray, the same question about last week. Rubio, Zelensky, Putin, the bombing of Moscow, and Trump opening the intel and military spigots. Your observations about what thread, if anything, connects them?
Judge, I don't think we should be surprised. After all, Trump was the very definition of unpredictability. The more so his lieutenants like Rubio, like Kellogg, they say one thing on Monday, a different thing on Tuesday. And what Rubio concluded there with the Ukrainians, why were the U.S. negotiating with the Ukrainians? I mean, a lot of the stuff doesn't make sense. What does make sense is that Steve Witkoff, he's the man, right? He's Trump's guy. What did he do with Netanyahu? He called him up and he said, look, I need to meet with you. No, tomorrow's the Sabbath. I need to meet you. Sit down, shut up. We're going to have a ceasefire. Now, Witkoff arrives in Moscow yesterday to the tune of Ukrainian drones and another attack on Moscow cities. Pinpricks don't make any difference. Maybe 3 people killed in that massive attack with 300 drones, okay? Witkoff arrived. Now, is Witkoff going to say, all right, Vladimir, sit down, shut up. This is what it's going to be. No, you're not going to do that. He's going to say, I don't know what Rubio is trying to do or Kellogg, but the president is telling me, what do you think about this new thing? And Putin says, I think it's great that the president wants peace. And I think that negotiation is the way to go. But, you know, there are certain nuances. There are certain things that need to be done with. And we know that Witkoff, who has just left Moscow, has the reports are that Putin told him, look, there's a whole hell of a lot left to be done before we talk about serious things. And guess what? The ball's not in our court. Forget it. We're winning, remember? Okay, the ball's in your court. Now, I think, and this is a guess, I think Trump wants a deal to the degree that he'll listen even more carefully. He's already met one condition, that is no Ukraine in NATO. I mean, he said that. He can understand why the Russians wouldn't want that. The other stuff is small potatoes. They could work it out, but Trump has to realize that Ukraine and the West, including the U.S., has lost this one.
So the Guardian of London is reporting that Putin kept Witkoff waiting for 3 hours.
Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think that Foreign Minister Lavrov kept Larry and me waiting for more than 3 minutes. He was very, very, very prompt, and we were more or less entertained by his head of PR while during that 3-minute time period. But more on our trip later. I have some clips that I want to play for you. The first is President Putin reacting to the Marco Rubio so-called ceasefire. Chris, cut number 16.
So how are they going to use these 30 days? Are they going to use it in order to continue the forced mobilization in Ukraine, in order to supply weapons to those areas, in order to newly mobilized units to undergo training? Question, who is going to give orders to ceasefire? And what is the value of these orders? Can you imagine about 2,000 kilometers? Who is going to determine who and where violated this agreement? That's an area of 2,000 kilometers. And then who is going to blame who? The violations of this agreement. All of these are questions that need to be thoroughly studied. We need to have a call with President Trump and discuss this, but the idea in itself to stop this conflict in a peaceful way, that's something that we support.
That was earlier today. Also earlier today was President Zelensky's response. Chris, cut number 3.
Moreover, what we've all heard from Russia now are very predictable, very manipulative words from Putin in response to the idea of silence on the front. He is essentially preparing to refuse as of now. Putin, of course, is afraid to tell President Trump directly that he wants to continue this war. that he wants to kill Ukrainians. And that's why they're there in Moscow, promoting the idea of silence, with such fabrications that nothing will come of it at all, or to make sure it doesn't work out for as long as possible. Putin often does this. He doesn't say no directly, but he does it this way. So it practically just drags everything out and makes normal solutions impossible.
Can the United States be an honest broker between the two when in reality we're a co-belligerent? We provoked the war, we manifested the war, we pay for the war, we stopped paying for the war, we resume paying for the war.
I think Ray was trying to jump in. Go ahead, Ray.
No, I just want to say a brief correction, Judge. That clip of Putin was yesterday.
Oh, okay. All right, go ahead.
Before Witkoff arrived, okay?
Yeah.
So he should have been forewarned. Now, I hadn't seen the Zelensky one, but if that comes after, well, that's even worse because Zelensky thinks he's driving the train here. He ain't driving the train anymore, and neither is Witkoff, who was kept waiting for 6 hours or whatever. So
you are correct. So we have the chronology correct. I misread the date. The Putin statement was yesterday. The Zelensky statement was earlier today. Larry.
Yeah, the Putin statement was, when he used the term nuance, those were his nuances. He was running down the, hey, ceasefire, man, great. We'd like to see an end to this conflict. But there's some nuances, such as we got a 2,000-mile front. Who's going to be the monitor that's going to go up and down and declare who violated the ceasefire? That's number one. How are we going to impose it? So he's got all of these questions laid out, just like a good lawyer, that have to be addressed. So he didn't tell the Donald Trump and Witkoff, screw you, hell no, and go away. No, much classier. It just, we got something we can talk about here. Because what the Russians are interested in, as we saw with Foreign Minister Lavrov, is getting re-engaged with the United States.
See, Putin made Trump expose his hand. That's why Trump is begging now for Putin to spare those thousands of troops that surround it. Some of them are NATO. That's what the peace agreement is for. So he will stop. So now they got to negotiate, but they have to. Putin folded their hand.
States who can have normal diplomatic relations. Doesn't mean you're always going to agree. But at the same time, as Ray noted, Putin kept Witkoff waiting. He sent in a message of who's in charge. The United States is not, Russia's not dancing to the United States too. It's the other way around. Zelensky, he doesn't hold any cards, but neither does Donald Trump. Trump doesn't even hold a Trump card, despite his name.
Ray, your comments.
Let's see. Yeah, I think what Larry alluded to before is extremely important. Never have I seen President Putin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Armed Forces, in fatigues. He was in fatigues in Kursk, okay, at the command center there. And he gave orders to Gerasimov, his chief of staff, look, I want this Kursk thing ended as soon as possible. We got them surrounded. Some of them don't qualify for Geneva Convention protections. They're mercenaries. We need to deal with it. We need to deal with it as soon as possible. Meanwhile, on this 2,000-kilometer other front, we're proceeding apace. Bottom line, Russia doesn't need a ceasefire. The last thing Russia wants is a ceasefire. The big thing it wants is a core agreement on rearranging things so Russia doesn't have to fear NATO in Ukraine any longer. And that's possible as long as somebody hits Trump over the top of the head with a 2x4.
Yeah.
Why do you think, Ray McGovern, Trump has reopened the spigot of military supply and intel to the Ukrainians after closing both of them for 2 weeks?
I think that one of the marginal people in the Pentagon or the White House said, hey, this might be a good idea. Yeah, we turn it off. Now, if you turn it on, maybe they'll be nicer. It doesn't make any sense, Judge. I suspect that it's not going to last very long. In any case, it's far too late to have any effect on the battlefield. Somebody needs to tell Trump that. And then, Putin is going to have to just wait. He's patient. And he's got his own people looking over his shoulder saying, look, don't be deceived again, for God's sake. The last thing we need is a Minsk 3.
Yeah. Well, and Judge, just let me chime in there.
Sure.
What we heard that from Lavrov specifically. He didn't quite come out and say, we've been bamboozled in the past, but as he reviewed the history of what has transpired, he made it clear that every time we've caved in to give a ceasefire, the Ukrainians have taken advantage of it to build up and then come back to attack us. And it's happened at least 4 times. So he said, we're done with that. We're going to make sure that we've got a firm solution to what is the underlying cause of this war, which goes in part to U.S. meddling in the foreign affairs of Russia and other countries, and the buildup of NATO.
Here's America's answer to Sergei Lavrov, declining to answer the question about whether he trusts Putin. Chris, cut number 1.
Do you trust Putin?
I think it's an irrelevant question. I think in foreign policy, it's not about trusting, it's about action. It's about things that you do. So in the end, on something like this, you can't just say you want peace, you have to do peace. And that's true for both sides in any conflict. So in any war and in any engagement. So I think ultimately all these things, I would just encourage you guys, if we're going to be serious about foreign policy, to sort of navigate away from some of this is not a reality show. This is not about personalities. This is very simple. You either do things or you don't. There are things you are doing and things you're not doing. So I think it's important. I get there's this temptation to cover foreign policy the way we cover domestic policy and the way we cover other things in our society. But foreign policy is about nation states pursuing what they have interpreted to be in their national interest. And balancing that is what the art of diplomacy and the work of foreign policy is all about. And so we need to sort of be mature and open-eyed and realistic without losing our idealism, without losing, what we hope the world will look like and want to shape it and be a part of. But by the same token, we have to make pragmatic decisions every single day. And that's not true today. That's always.
Still a neocon, Ray.
No, Judge, I think he performed reasonably well there. It's not about trust. It's about verifying. Doverai no proverai. Trust but verify. There is no trust between the U.S. and Russia right now, but it can be induced if you have an agreement that can be properly verified.
Well,
We
I wish
showed
you had
that.
given the answer the way you did instead of a BS scolding of the press.
Well, when you're a Secretary of State, that's what you do. You try to deflect attention. You say, well, look, this is, I don't hold any brief exactly for his words, but what he's saying is, look, a trust is really important. There isn't any now, but there can be if we come to a solution that is appropriately verified. And we've done that with the ABM treaty, with the INF treaty, with Open Skies treaty. We've done that before. We could do it again, especially given the sophistication of the monitoring devices that we have all over the world and in space. We could do it if there's a will. And I think there is a will on the part of both Putin and Trump to do this thing. So it can get done. It just has to take a little bit more time.
He didn't say this when we were with him, Larry, but don't you think Foreign Minister Lavrov has great suspicions about the United States? Because as I used earlier, the phrase, we are co-belligerents with Ukraine against Russia, and that's been resumed. Thank you, Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, he doesn't trust, as Ray was pointing out, anything the United States says. What is the United States actually doing? Now, in that regard, we come back to one of your initial questions with respect to restarting intelligence sharing, if that's true, and continuing the flow of military equipment to Ukraine. That will be then interpreted as, we hear you're saying that you want to bring an end to this, but the fact is you're facilitating it, you're enabling it. The reality right now is this war could end tomorrow. All Donald Trump has to do is pull the plug completely. And the fact that he's not doing it is going to be in the back of the minds of the Russians that, they can't fully trust the United States. At least there is the talking at the diplomatic level that was not occurring under Biden. And to that extent, the Russians are pleased with that. I won't say they're happy or ecstatic, but they welcome that as a positive sign without pretending or ignoring the other overt actions of hostile actions by the United States.
How dangerous was it for Kyiv, Ray, to have no access to any intel from the Five Eyes?
It was suicidal. I mean, you can't operate with that kind of access. So there's sort of a lull in the fighting from the Ukrainian side. That's because they have not had access to this, but it's only been a couple of days. George, I'd like to make a more important point. I compliment you and Larry on the fact there was this mutual trust between you and Lavrov just the last couple of days ago. And I appreciate his sense of humor when he talked about Führer Ursula von der Leyen, and when he talked about the French nuclear umbrella. Yes, 3 or 4 bombs, okay? But this kind of confidence could be a little bit too reassuring to the Russian leaders who are riding high right now, okay? One little French bomb can ruin your whole day, okay, and ruin the whole world. The other thing I'll say is that even in his candor, Lavrov pulled his punches, okay? What could he have cited?
Well, here's the most startling thing he said, in my view, and Larry, of course, was seated right there. Cut number 10, Chris.
Prime Minister of Denmark. She said that these days Ukraine is weak. Ukraine cannot be fairly treated now. Therefore, for Ukraine today, peace is worse than war. She said this. Yes, let's pump Ukraine with weapons again, and when we have shaken Russian position, then let's see whether we can talk. And the chief of German intelligence a couple of days ago said that it would be bad for Ukraine and for Europe if the war ends before 2029, and 2030 even better. Yes, they say these things. And when President Trump was interrogating President Zelensky in the Oval Office, asking him many times, "You don't want to negotiate." Zelensky was trying to avoid an answer.
As you know, because you were there, that was me guffawing, huh?
Yeah.
They want the war to go on to 2029.
You should turn your mic down if you're going to guffaw there, Judd. Turn your mic down. Guffaws are not allowed.
Why would the head of German intel say something as inane as that, Larry?
Yeah, I call this is Children's Dress-Up Day for Europe. Europe used to be a serious customer. Germany used to be an industrial power. The French used to have the largest army in Europe, and it was actually had some competence to it. And the United Kingdom used to, rule the world, and the pound sterling was a principal currency. They're all a joke now. They're all everybody's talking tough about, boy, they're going to go kick some Russian booty, and man, they're going to put Putin in line, and they're going to do this, they're going to do that, and the old expression that they're writing checks with their mouths that they can't cash, and that's the reality. So these kinds of threats, that's why Russia as a whole, Putin, Lavrov, and the rest of the government, they don't take Europe seriously anymore, or as somebody that they need to engage, because what does Europe bring to the table other than problems? nothing. They don't bring natural resources. They don't bring financial wealth. They don't bring military power. And Ray was correct to note that even one French bomb or one English nuclear bomb, yes, would be terrible, would be devastating. But we're talking overall in terms of the conventional military force of these countries. They're laughable.
Right.
Just, Judge, if I could pick up on what Larry said there, not only is it clear that the Russians are treating the Europeans with utter disdain, but they're saying so. I'm not sure. I think it was Medvedev or maybe Peskov just 3 days ago said, you know, the Europeans, bunch of pygmies at the top of Europe. They're delusional and they have to change or we have to defeat them. So Europe is really kind of a disdainful object of Russian disdain. And the other thing I just want to interject here, in that long litany of actually provable examples where there was treachery and the Russians were deceived, Lavrov left out one thing, and that's why I was referring to his adherence to some diplomatic niceties.
Right.
The President of the United States, Biden, on the 30th of December, promised Putin, look, we agree, no offensive strike missiles. We're in an alliance with the Russians. When was that?
Yeah.
I was alive during that. Yeah, that was World War II, right? Okay.
Yeah.
People forget that. And you know, the statistics of 27 million Soviets dying against 4,000 U.S. all soldiers. The fact that Russia was destroyed and we escaped except for Pearl Harbor, the Russians look at that and they say, these Americans are really lucky and they don't know anything about war, but the time is up. The ocean doesn't mean anything. Lavrov has actually said that. These oceans are not going to protect the U.S. next time. So the Russians look on us as being kind of naive, not knowledgeable about the horrors of war. And that's a problem because that reduces their time to think about what might happen if they see something really bad coming, like an errant missile from France.
You know, I think Larry agrees, the most amazing thing we saw was an interactive detail, historical accuracy. There were actors and there were also mannequins, but it was deeply, deeply, profoundly moving. I'd never seen anything like this in any museum anywhere in the world, and I've been all over the world loving museums. I think you agree, Larry.
Yeah, it's called the Victory Museum. It was, as Judge said, one of the most remarkable. I've been through all the Smithsonian's. I've never seen anything like this. It really, it grabs you. It brings you into it, and you begin to develop some appreciation for why this 80 years later, this great patriotic war still resonates among the Russian people.
Ray, what do you think happens next?
Well, let me just add a footnote here. 4 months before they killed him, President John F. Kennedy pointed out in a major speech that almost alone among the major powers of the world, Russia and the United States have never been at war one against the other. That's big. Not only is that the case, but we were major allies. Neither of us could have won, I don't think, so quickly at least, in World War II. Now, I forget your question, Judge. You wanted me to...
Yeah, you know what? You've ended this on a beautiful and moving note, and in case anybody missed it,
The shameful retreat of the Ukrainian army from the Kursk region and the entry of Russian troops into the Sumi Oblast has become the primary topic of discussion in all global media, including commentary from experts and analysts. Everything that is happening right now in the northern part of Ukraine indicates that the flight of the Ukrainian army from the Kursk region is just the beginning of major problems for the whole of Ukraine. So, on the morning of March 13th, amid the chaotic retreat of the Ukrainian army from the Kursk region, Russian troops entered the settlement of Basavka, in the northern part of the Sumi region. As of March 14, 2025, the Russian army managed to take control of the entire northern part of this settlement. Simultaneously with this, Russian troops also crossed the border of the Sumi region near Zuravka area. It is reported that this settlement came under the control of the Russian army on the evening of March 13th. Currently, the Russian army is developing an offensive on the Sumi region from two directions at once. Thus, Russian troops began to carry out Vladimir Putin's order, which demanded the creation of a so-called buffer zone in northern Ukraine to secure the southern borders of the Russian Federation. At the same time, the question remains: what exactly this buffer zone in the northern part of Ukraine will look like? Many reputable Russian experts, citing their own sources in the Russian military department, said that the Russian army, in order to secure the southwestern borders of the Russian Federation, would take control not only of the entire Sumi region, but also of the Chernihiv Oblast. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has officially commented on the West's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. In particular, during a meeting with the Belarusian leader in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin officially stated that Russia has always been a supporter of peace talks, and that Moscow currently agrees to cease hostilities. However, the Russian leader stressed that Moscow will take this step only if this ceasefire leads to a long-term and sustainable peace. In summary, Vladimir Putin explicitly hinted that Russia would consent to a cessation of hostilities for a duration of 30 days solely on the condition that Ukraine refrains from receiving military support from Western nations, as well as from mobilizing and reinforcing its military forces during this interval. Thus, Putin diplomatically put forward counter-conditions, knowing full well that the Kiev regime and its Western masters would not agree to stop the flow of weapons to Ukraine and limit the number of Ukrainian troops. Thus, it becomes clear that Putin primarily relies only on the Russian army for the complete demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. By the way, yesterday's Russian massive missile attack on military installations and logistics hubs in Ukraine once again proved that the West is still actively arming this Eastern European country, and that only decisive actions by the Russian army will allow Moscow to solve this problem once and for all. So, while the whole world was discussing Vladimir Putin's military uniform, the Russian aerospace forces, together with the missile forces, launched another massive missile attack on military installations and infrastructure facilities in the southern, central, and northern parts of Ukraine. This time, Russian missiles rained down on such Ukrainian regions as Kiev, Poltava, Sumi, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa. It is well known that during this attack, Russia used dozens of Iskander-M ballistic missiles, as well as Kh-32 cruise missiles. At the same time, in order to overload Ukrainian and Western air defense systems, Russia has also increased the number of germanium kamikaze drones used. By the way, this massive missile attack on Ukraine has become so powerful and effective that many experts have already dubbed it Moscow's response to the recent Ukrainian massive drone attack on the western regions of the Russian Federation. Moreover, many Russian TG channels are confident that this is just the beginning and that in the next few days or even hours, Russia will deliver another crushing blow to the military installations of the Ukrainian army and NATO forces on the territory of Ukraine. Meanwhile, yesterday, in Galasayevsky district of Kiev, the Russian military destroyed a classified industrial enterprise that worked for the needs of the Ukrainian army. It is reported that this enterprise produced hundreds of FPV drones per month. In the Poltava region, in cities such as Mirgorod and Kremenchuk, Russian missiles and kamikaze drones rained down on facilities of the fuel and energy complex, parking lots for military vehicles, military warehouses, and logistics centers of the Ukrainian army and NATO forces. In Sumi and Chernihiv regions, for an hour, Russian kamikaze drones attacked enemy targets located near the highway that leads to the Kursk and Belgorod regions. In Zaporizhia region, the Russian military dealt a devastating blow to critical infrastructure facilities. In particular, in the southwestern part of the city of Zaporizhia, Russian cruise missiles, together with kamikaze drones, hit and destroyed 2 communication stations. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, in the western part of the city of Kryvyi Rog, a Russian ballistic missile Iskander-M once again struck Hotel Druzhba. It is reported that at the time of this missile strike, there were foreign mercenaries from France, Canada, and Germany in this hotel. Unfortunately, as of March 15th, there is still no accurate data on the number of victims among the so-called soldiers of fortune. Let me remind you that this is the second missile attack on this hotel. In August 2023, Russian missiles destroyed the right wing of this hotel, along with dozens of Ukrainian and NATO officers. And finally, in the Odessa region, in the port area of the city of Odessa, 2 Russian Iskander-M ballistic missiles hit a 178-meter-long bulk carrier that entered the port of Odessa under the flag of Barbados. According to the Russian military department, this bulk carrier was regularly used by the British Ministry of Defense in London's interests. Moreover, as it turned out, at the time of this missile attack, there was a large batch of various ammunition on board this bulk carrier, including British Starstreak surface-to-air missiles. According to numerous witnesses, about 7 powerful explosions occurred on board this bulk carrier, as a result of which the starboard side of the ship plunged into the water by 70%. Such a large number of explosions is explained by the detonation of valuable military cargo on board this ship.
And we're going to do it in chronological order. We'll begin with Vladimir Putin's response, and also we have a statement from Mr. Yuri Uchakov, and then we're going to take a look at Trump's reaction, and then later down the line, we're going to get to the Ukrainians. So yesterday, Vladimir Putin has given the much-anticipated answer to the ceasefire proposal, and I can only describe it as a masterclass in saying no. Now, I appreciate the Western mainstream media is basically saying, yes, Vladimir Putin has agreed. No, he has not. What he said is that Russia is and was always open to a diplomatic solution to this war. However, he said that certain questions need answering before a ceasefire can be agreed upon. And he laid out a few examples. Kursk, the 2,000-kilometer front line, rearmament of Ukraine, policing the ceasefire. In fact, one of the points that he stressed out the most was the situation in Kursk. Because according to Vladimir Putin, Ukrainians are now contained in the Kursk pocket in a very small space who have completely lost operational control. And as far as the Russians are concerned, those Ukrainian forces have only 2 options: surrender, or the alternative is pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? That's what Vladimir Putin is saying. And he raised the question, if Russia was to engage into a ceasefire right now, what will happen to those troops? Will they just be allowed to move back into Ukraine? Will the Ukrainian command issue a surrender order? What's going to happen? Also, he raised another point, which was, who's going to police the 2,000-kilometer front line? It's a big front line. And who's going to be responsible to whom? Who's going to be the figure of authority? Another point that he raised, and I think this is a fair point, I've raised it yesterday, is what will happen during the ceasefire? Are both countries going to rearm? Is Ukraine going to be rearmed by the United States and the West? Because that's the last thing that Russia would agree with. These are all questions that need to be answered. But the American diplomacy in this peace negotiation, just overall, if you want my thoughts, is that it's a little bit rushed. Not the peace itself, but the process. Like, can we get a deal now? Can we do it tomorrow? Maybe now. It just doesn't work that way, not with the Russians and not with anybody, I guess, who has been in a conflict for 3 years. Now, the only reason the green t-shirt is so desperate for this is because the Ukrainian army is collapsing all across the front line. I've seen a statement from him, from the green t-shirt, I think it was yesterday at about 2:30 p.m., in which he said, well, more than 24 hours have passed since this proposal has been put forward and there's still no answer from Vladimir Putin. You could tell he was eager, he was keen, he was desperate for an answer. And that's because the situation on the ground, well, it just reflects the dire situation of the Ukrainian armed forces. And this is not a dig at them, this is just a reality, it's a fact. Point being, the Ukrainians, they have strong incentives to go as quickly as possible to a ceasefire, even if they weren't to rearm, just to catch the breath. But the Russians, on the other hand, they're on an active offensive, they have much less incentives to do that. So, as Vladimir Putin is saying, some questions need answering. And also, he hinted at the fact that today, during the phone call which he will have with Donald Trump, those questions hopefully will get an answer. So it's not a definitive no on the part of Vladimir Putin, but it depends on the conversation with Donald Trump. And also speaking of Donald Trump, we're going to take a look at some of his statements afterwards. I think they're absolutely hilarious, some of them. Also, we have a statement from Mr. Uchakov. Let me read that to you. Yuri Uchakov, Russian leader Vladimir Putin's foreign policy advisor, has said that Moscow does not want a temporary truce with Ukraine, but is instead interested in a long-term settlement. Quote, I don't think anyone needs any steps that imitate peaceful actions in this situation. He added that Russia's goal is a long-term peaceful settlement that should take into account Russia's legitimate interests. This is the exact same line which the Russians have been giving us for the past 3 years. This is not news, by the way. Russia always stated that they're open to a diplomatic solution to this conflict as long as it takes into account Russia's legitimate security interests. Hence why we had the Istanbul agreements, an attempt to diplomacy, which finally failed because of one Boris Johnson. But the point is, this is not news. Russia always said that they're looking for a permanent, long-term solutions, not for a quick ceasefire, a quick deal, some frozen conflict. That's not what Russia's looking for. And I don't think Ukraine is looking for that either. With that in mind, let us go to Mr. Trump. Trump on Putin's ceasefire statement, promising but not complete. Trump said Putin's statement was very promising but not complete. Trump noted that his envoy, Steve Witkoff, is engaged in serious negotiations in Russia and is expected to meet with Putin soon. Quote, hopefully Russia will do the right thing, the United States president said. Well, maybe Mr. Trump can tell us exactly what the right thing is. And the right thing for whom? Because make no mistake, Russia is doing the right thing for Russia, just as the United States has been doing the right thing for the United States. Every country is pursuing its own interest. Russia, Ukraine, the United States, France, everybody is doing the same things. Except Germany, they're acting against their self-interest, but that's another conversation. The point is that you can't just say those words because this is not about some moral high ground here. This is about a country's legitimate security interest. And when it comes to the right thing, the only right thing they're interested in is their own good. That's it, no more. So these statements are just are very, very light. Let's move on because he said some more. Trump emphasized that the ceasefire is the first stage of negotiations. Quote, we've been discussing with Ukraine land, and pieces of land will be kept and lost, and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, involved, a very big power plant. Who's going to get the power plant and who's going to get this and that? And so, you know, it's not an easy process. I have a question for you. What's wrong with that statement? Because something is definitely out of place there. I find it astonishing that this type of conversations are actually taking place in between Ukraine and the United States. If anything, this is a conversation for Russia and Ukraine. They need to have this conversation and they need to figure out the answers together. The United States, as they say, they're not a party to this conflict. So why are they telling Ukraine which part of the land they will keep, which part they will lose? It seems that everything is backwards. However, this is the world we live in. Let's continue. The US president also stated that NATO and Russia's presence in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine were also topics of discussion between US and Ukrainian representatives. Trump also addressed Ukraine's NATO membership, stating that everybody knows what's the answer to that question. Quote, they discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what's the answer to that. They've known this answer for 40 years, he said. In other words, translation, Trump is saying that no NATO membership for Ukraine, which is his consistent position, we have to say, since he took up on the role of a mediator. Fair enough. The Ukrainians, however, they don't agree with that, and I'm going to show you their answer. Ukraine presents red lines for peace talks to United States, NATO membership among them. Quote, we also discussed the NATO issue and made it clear that for Ukraine it cannot be removed from the agenda, the source explained. This seems to be a big point of contention because the green t-shirt, he just doesn't want to let go of the idea of becoming a NATO member. Whereas on the other hand, you have the NATO boss, Donald Trump, saying, no, you've known this answer for 40 years, it's not going to happen. And it's not the first time he's saying that, by the way. So what do we make of that? From my perspective, I don't think that the green t-shirt understands what he's really signaling to Russia with these types of statements. You're basically inviting the Russians to say no to more and more ceasefire agreements, peace proposals, because for them, NATO is a red line. And it was a red line long before this conflict even started. So I'm not sure if they understand that they're doing more harm than good with these statements. But that's by the by. Let us look at the next statement. Quote, for Ukraine, there are red lines, including that there can be no restrictions on the size of the defense forces and no prohibitions on Ukraine's participation in international organizations, including the EU and NATO. The issue of NATO also came up in remarks by the head of the Ukrainian president's office, Andriy Yermak, stressing that Russia must not have a veto right. I've been saying this a few times, Mr. Yermak, but this is not about a veto right. This is about the principle of indivisible security. You simply cannot adhere to NATO if that poses a direct threat to Russia, your neighbor. That's what this principle states. And that's because NATO has designated Russia its principal enemy. It's the whole reason for why NATO exists. Do you start to connect the dots? I'm sure you don't. Not a problem. The point is that Ukraine is saying that they're red lines and they won't accept this and they won't accept that. Well, the problem is when you're losing a conflict, militarily speaking, well, you don't get to dictate any red lines. That's the one problem with that statement. I don't recall a single country in history who has lost a war on the ground, on the battlefield, and then they were the ones imposing the red lines. However, we have to also speak about the other side of the equation. And that's simple. You see, this conflict, everybody knows, including the Americans, they've admitted themselves that this was a proxy war. So I can also understand the Ukrainian frustration. I can understand it very well. Because the way they look at it is like, look, master, from across the ocean, we were your proxy. We did everything you asked of us. So now we also want something for us because it looks like we're going to be the ones losing it all. And that's a fair question. And this is why this is just one more example for why proxy wars should never be a thing. Because in the end, the only party who gets shafted is the proxy. This is a lesson for the world. Do not ever become a proxy. That's the moral of the story. Because their frustrations now, even though they might seem a little bit illogical, they're very much understandable. Let's move on. Ukraine and US reject Minsk III and frozen conflict, says head of Zelensky's office. Mr. Yermak, quote, we are firmly against it and our position fully aligns with that of our American partners. They too oppose a frozen conflict. They also reject any so-called Minsk III agreements or similar Admitted it was all a sham. So I think this is the one thing in the world that they can actually agree upon. I know it's not a funny thing, but it's also a little bit funny when you look at it, because there doesn't seem to be many things that these two sides can agree upon. But this is definitely one of them. Let's move on because we have one more statement. Additionally, Yermak highlighted that a separate provision had been established during the meeting, ensuring that European representatives would participate in the peace process. This is the hilarious statement because it hides a mountain of incompetence. Not on behalf of the Ukrainians, by the way, but on behalf of the Europeans. Let me explain. You see, what Mr. Yermak is essentially saying is that Ukraine and the United States, they've both agreed to invite the Europeans at their table. When I say their table, I mean the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. That's their table. The Europeans, they're making a lot of background noise saying, we want to be at that table too. My question is, if you consider yourself such a big entity, such a huge force, then you should really be having your own table. You shouldn't be making noise like a child asking to be at the adult's table, because that's exactly what it looks like, looking from the outside in. Nobody's stopping Europe, by the way, from creating their own table. They can always put the hand on the phone and call Mr. Lavrov or call Vladimir Putin and have a conversation, organize a meeting, something. But of course, they won't do that. They're far more comfortable with letting the United States do the talking, and just behind Donald Trump, they'll keep peeking out from time to time to see if the coast is clear. This is absolutely infantile behavior, but is exactly what we have come to expect from these people. My friends, I'll leave this episode here. Let me know what
you cannot disguise her anymore. There are no more.
Take it or leave it. Does he know what he's doing? Ceasefire. But before we do,
yes,
I had an unbelievable week last week in Moscow, but I must relate one incident to you. As I was walking into a very, very fine restaurant called the Bolshoi. It's in the same block as the Bolshoi Ballet.
Very, very good. Yes.
A man and his wife are coming out, and the man says to me, "Are you Judge Napolitano?" And I said, "Yes." And then he goes, "Are you friends with Pepe Escobar?"
I'm embarrassed.
Pepe is better known than I am.
No, definitely not, Judge.
Does Marco Rubio manifest a full understanding of the complexities of international diplomacy when he makes an announcement like, "We just cut a deal with the Ukrainians. It's up to you, the Russians, to take it or leave it"? Does he know what he's doing?
No, obviously not. First of all, because he's not an experienced diplomat. Like you just saw early this week in Moscow, what is the greatest diplomat of our times? How does he behave? How he organizes his thought? How he understands the other, whatever the other is, a big superpower or a small country in Africa. It doesn't matter. You know, this is a true diplomat. I proposed the characterization of this bombastic ceasefire as a kabuki, as you mentioned, but as a kabuki inside a matryoshka. So you have the typical Russian matryoshka with lots of kabuki masks inside. And you start peeling off the masks, and at the end, probably you have the mini kabuki mask inside the matryoshka is a Minsk tree dancer. And you cannot disguise her anymore. There are no more masks to peel off. So obviously Rubio could never understand that if he said that in public for the world public opinion to digest, you have to back it with facts. And he didn't have any facts in hand. It's very simple, because Rubio or even President Trump, they don't have the cards. Who has the cards? President Putin. So what happened just a few minutes ago? The Putin press conference after the meeting with Lukashenko. And it was something absolutely extraordinary. It was really a bombshell. He ripped the notion of a ceasefire based on literally nothing. And he proposed a true conversation where the ceasefire is included. So he started qualifying what the ceasefire will be. And it was a masterpiece. It was like a Caravaggio painting the chiaroscuro in the painting. You know, amazing, absolutely amazing. He talked about Kursk. He talked about a long-term resolution, peace long-term, not a gimmick, which is this notion of the Rubio ceasefire is. And now we have the president of the Russian Federation saying basically, yes, we accept the ceasefire, but this is what we have to discuss about the ceasefire and around the ceasefire. This is also called diplomacy, because it didn't reject the American proposal.
So do you think that the Americans believe that Putin will drop his 4 or 5 demands, which he's made since day one?
Exactly.
Neutrality, territorial sovereignty, new elections, no NATO, no military. Are the Americans naive enough to think that? Before you answer that, here is the actual announcement by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Chris, cut number 13.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable. We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball's now in their court.
We also got into substantive details on how this war is going to permanently end. We have a named delegation in terms of next steps from the Russian side. We have a named delegation in terms of next steps from the Ukrainian side. I will talk to my Russian counterpart in the coming days. Secretary Rubio will be with G7 foreign ministers in the next couple of days. We have the NATO Secretary General in the White House on Thursday, and we'll take the process forward from there.
Is it me, or are they amateurs?
Amateurs, absolutely amateurs. Well, not to mention Tutti Frutti or Ruti, the NATO Secretary General, former Prime Minister of Holland, and they are inconsequential. So G7 meeting. Obviously, this is a negotiation between Washington and Moscow. It's very clear.
Washington and Foreign Minister Lavrov knows this. Washington is not a neutral. Washington is a co-belligerent in the war.
In fact, they started the war, Judge.
Yes.
To be precise, this is a war started by let's say the Washington axis, all those silos in power in Washington that even before 2014 and Maidan agreed that we have to launch another operation to undermine Russia, harass Russia, and maybe dismantle Russia short term or long term. This was even before Maidan, accelerated with Maidan, and accelerated, went turbo after the SMO 3 years ago. So this was an American proxy war against Russia from the beginning. And now we have the purely Kafkaesque situation of the party who actually launched the war is posing as the mediator. Call our friends in the past Metternich, like Larry talked, Talleyrand. What does that mean?
So in 1 week, Rubio and Waltz made this ridiculous announcement. Trump announced the reopening of the Biden-era pipeline to continue to deliver military and intelligence aid to Kyiv. And Kyiv sent 250 drones to attack residential neighborhoods in Moscow.
Yes, exactly.
How does the Kremlin view all of that happening at the same time?
Exactly at the same time. It was, if I'm not mistaken, 354 drones in total, most of them sent against Moscow. And the seriousness of this was reflected by Putin's visit to Gerasimov in Kursk, wearing a military uniform for the first time since the beginning of the SMO 3 years ago. This was immensely symbolic for every Russian, to start with, for everybody in all across Eurasia, and for the whole global South. Putin never put a military uniform in 3 years.
I would imagine that the image of him in a military uniform is all over the eastern part of the globe.
Absolutely, Judge. Everywhere, all across East Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, and across Eurasia. I am in this little corner here, Southeast Asia. Well, so we had this, what he said to Gerasimov and his briefing after listening.
Who is Gerasimov? Is that the commanding general on the ground?
Yes, the head of the general staff, General Valery Gerasimov, which, by the way, is extremely respected by the Ukrainians, including Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny, which the Brits are grooming to be the next leader in Ukraine, he profoundly respects Gerasimov. Okay, well, the fact that Putin went to Kursk in military fatigues and saying, look, more or less he was saying, look, I order you to finish this operation as soon as possible. Congratulations on what you have done already, but let's finish as soon as possible. There are two options for the remaining Ukrainian fighters: surrender or die, literally.
Or no, look at your screen.
Yes.
That is President Putin in military gear speaking with General Gerasimov.
Exactly. And very, very important. This was the I would say the confluence of the victory in Kursk, which is now inevitable, and those 354 drones against several targets all across the Russian Federation, which was a desperate gambit, last-minute gambit by the Ukrainians to prove to their Western backers, look, we can still do something. You know, we are harassing the Russians. So considering that Putin had to go to Kursk to make his point in Kursk, that it's essential to finally liberate Russian territory in Kursk, and then surrender or die for the Ukrainians. And very, very important, all the mercenaries, and there are a lot of foreign mercenaries in Kursk, they will be treated as mercenaries, and they are not protected by the Geneva Conventions.
Ritter says that they will all be executed on the spot, which under the Geneva Convention would be lawful.
Exactly. If they are executed en masse, it will be lawful because they are not protected by Geneva. Wow. So when we put this all together, and the fact that immediately afterwards, like one day after that, he goes on this press conference after meeting with Lukashenko it was a very important meeting of the Union State, Russia and Belarus. And after that was a press conference. And there is this absolutely bombshell press conference where he actually accepts the ceasefire and gives the list of everything that has to be discussed, including what everybody knows since at least June last year. The main conditions: neutral Ukraine, no NATO or European peacekeeping forces, analyzing the root causes of the war, what led to the war even before Maidan and even before the beginning of the SMO 3 years ago, and of course part of a larger diplomatic, military, and geopolitical conversation with the Americans to look, let's have some civilized rules of the game from now on between both of us superpowers.
Very interesting. Now, I had, before I ask you about the talk that you observed by the Chinese foreign minister, I
Yes.
had a marvelous 2.5 hours, 2 hours taped, half hour, some small talk
Yes.
with one of the, probably the most brilliant diplomat in the world today, Sergei Lavrov. I was deeply moved that I was invited. There were only 3 of us that got to question him. One of them was another colleague of ours, Larry Johnson.
I saw the whole thing, Judge, of course.
Okay, you saw the whole thing. He gives long answers. And then, of course, he has small talk with you. But you said in your note to me that as a result of your observations of this, you, Pepe Escobar, had some questions for me.
Yes. Can I play the journalist for only 2 minutes, Judge, if you allow me?
What do you mean play a journalist? You're one of the world's best known and highly regarded journalists.
Okay. My first question is very instinctive. What was your gut feeling of sitting down with the foremost diplomat of our times? What did you feel, beneath all his brilliance and what he was telling you? The man behind it. What was your instinct when you start to analyze the man, Sergei Lavrov?
Very relaxed, very down to earth, very, if I can use the diplomatic phrase, disarming. So he said to me, when I first arrived, I went directly to the studio. When I first arrived in Moscow on Thursday, I went directly to the studios of our mutual friend, Dmitry Simes.
Dmitry
to
Simes,
tape
yes.
a 30-minute segment of his show, The Great Game, which is the political talk show that the elites all watch in Russia. So now it is Monday morning, and I'm in the formal reception rooms of the foreign ministry in Moscow, and he says to me, "I'm disappointed in you, Judge Napolitano." Why? What happened? You came to Moscow and you first went to Dmitry Simes, and I have to wait 5 days to meet you. The next time you come to Moscow, you come to me first.
You come to me first.
Very disarming. And then we were chatting, and he says, so in the old days, I lived in the same neighborhood where you live. He obviously knows where my apartment is in New York City, which is very close to the UN. So he knows I live there. And he said, I know that neighborhood because I lived there for 10 years from 81 to 91.
When he was ambassador.
Very disarming and very normal, very gracious. What was a little out of body experience was his very, very long, highly articulate answers. I'm thinking to myself, am I really sitting in the conference room of the foreign minister of Russia, listening to him answer my questions and the questions of my colleagues, or am I dreaming this?
In detail.
I didn't dream it. It happened.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. In detail, in a very sophisticated manner.
Very detailed.
With the breadth of
very
vision that is mind-boggling.
Yeah, one of my questions was a double-part question. After he answered the first part, which took about 15 minutes, he looked at me, made eye contact, "Know about NATO." And then he remembered the second half of the question, and he launched into a dissertation like that. He also said to me afterwards, I hope, I'll stop trying to imitate him. I hope you didn't think my answers were too long. Now, I did, but I wasn't going to say anything. He said, you're lucky you're not Tucker Carlson, because President Putin's first answer to him was 45 minutes long. And we learned later that Tucker had to go to the restroom. What? You can't make this stuff up.
So for you, this was an outstanding experience in your professional life, wasn't it?
It surely was. Yes, it surely was.
What was
I thought of you because of your linguistic skills and because you know all these people. For me, it was a novel experience. You know, I had security when I was on the bench, but the level of security in Moscow to go anywhere near a government official is truly, truly extraordinary, but comforting. I mean, at that moment in my life, I was probably one of the best protected people on the planet because I enjoyed the benefits of everybody that was there to protect him. I did speak to Maria, refresh me on her last name.
Zakharova.
And I said to her, you know, Maria, you are always welcome on Judging Freedom. She said, well, we watch Judging Freedom here. I said, well, we'd like to watch Judging Freedom with you on. She said, we'll see if we can arrange it. So like a diplomat, she didn't say yes and she didn't say no.
Judge, seriously, everybody that is anybody in Moscow watches your show. Seriously. And they comment afterwards. And then when we meet, foreigners and Russian and all that, always something that happened during the show is part of the conversation. Well, my second question is very, very simple. What about Moscow, Judge? Isn't that absolutely dazzling?
It is absolutely dazzling. Now, I stayed in a hotel near...
You stayed at the Metropole, right?
I stayed at the Metropole, which is
Perfect.
the place to stay, right near Red Square. That's the older part of the city. It reminded me of downtown Manhattan, not Midtown, downtown.
Downtown Manhattan.
But still hustling, bustling, and beautiful. Some narrow alleyways and winding streets. It was gorgeous. But the financial district,
You went to Moscow City. You went to Moscow City. Yeah.
Hello, my last video about forced conscription in Ukraine became popular, and since it isn't really detailed, I decided to make a second part. But I really recommend to watch my previous video for better understanding. Today I will tell you about database of confirmed cases of forced conscription and tell more about the terror of TCK. By the way, in the day when I uploaded my previous video, the bill on criminal liability for TCK recruiters for illegal mobilization has been cancelled. Now they can keep hunting people without any responsibility. Some people in comments under my previous video asked for confirmation that this mess is really happening in Ukraine. There is a website called UA Draft Museum. I will left link in the description, and it contains a database of confirmed cases of incidents with TCK. Now there are a little less than 500 cases with video footage. Many of them also has geolocation attached, and it's only cases with video confirmation. Just imagine how many times there was no one to record or to publish the video. Now I want to remind you that this channel is only sponsored by you, so if you want to support me, you can do it on Boosty using the link in the description. If you didn't watch my previous video, the organization responsible for this insanity is TCK, Territorial Completion Center. Recently I found this video from the city of Dnieper, where a recruiter from TCK enjoys the ride on Tesla hood. If you have an account in X, please send this to Elon. I'm sure he's gonna like it. And by the way, I found 5 different videos where people are driving TCK walkers around on the hood. I'm sure there are many more of such videos. I want to remind you that I am showing you only the softest videos without beating or fighting, because if I will show you an average video with TCK, YouTube will instantly put an age restriction and no one will see this video. If you want to see the videos where TCK are literally beating up conscripts, I posted some in my Telegram channel. I really recommend you to watch this video to the end if you want to know about Ukrainian songs about draft dodgers, or if you want to see the Tinder profiles of Ukrainian girls. So the workers of TCK are doing everything to draft as many men as possible. Here you can see how they are forcing men out of the car using the pepper spray. There are plenty of videos in Telegram where recruiters from TCK are insulting people they are taking. They have no respect. They are openly threatening to their victims. I've seen a video where a recruiter said to men that he has the right to kill him right now. Of course, sometimes people hunters are killing conscripts. There are several confirmed cases, 6 of which I found articles about in Ukrainian media, but there are obviously many more. I also found this video where they hit guy with their car. Police and TCK are capturing men together. That's the duty of Ukrainian police since spring 2024. Here you can see how they try to take away the child of a guy who they want to draft. I decided to cut the sound in all of these videos because it's too shocking. By the way, here you can see the condition of the barracks where captured people are brought. And here you can see a man dancing with a paper that is protecting him from conscription. If you didn't watch my previous video, I want to remind you that Ukrainian borders are closed for men over 18. And all Ukrainian borders are looking just like a concentration camp. I showed the shore of Tisa in my previous video, and some people said that it's not Tisa since it's too wide, so I found more footage of this river, and you can see the same 2 rows of a barbed wire. Dozens of drowned people are found there. The borders are also mined. If you're interested to know how Ukrainians are escaping Ukraine, watch my previous video. And this is footage from the Carpathian Mountains, and it looks really sad and depressive. Ukrainian society obviously hates TCK, and here are some examples. In previous video I mentioned that word "ухилянт", which means draft dodger, became a meme. And here are some songs about Uhilans. I found at least 3 of them. I translated lyrics with Google Translate, and I hope that's enough to understand the meaning. Also, you can buy a bracelet with a prayer asking Mother of God to save you from TCK. And some girls promise to protect you from TCK on their Tinder profiles. Anyway, situation is terrible and it keeps getting worse. In one of my next videos, I will talk about the resistance of Ukrainian people against TCK. There is a lot to tell. Please share this video in your media. I think more people need to know about it. If you want to support me, you can leave a like, a comment, or a donation by the link in the description. Thanks for watching.
Ukraine to agree to a 30-day total ceasefire, which before they weren't. And now he's trying to put pressure on the Russian side to also agree to that. Vladimir Putin has conceptually said he agrees to it, but he's got some pretty heavy conditions that he's placed on it, a lot of questions he's asking, which leads one to wonder, is there really going to be a ceasefire? Now, one of the things that's driving President Trump, which certainly we at this channel have been in agreement with from the beginning, all the way back through, from the beginning, all the way into the Trump administration, from the Biden administration, and we're really glad to see that he's focused on the human condition. One of the things that he talked about just this morning as evidence of that is that, as we've been talking about, the Kursk incursion that Ukraine had been holding since August of last year has totally collapsed. And there's one small pocket left where there's apparently several hundred Ukraine soldiers still trapped inside. And the Russians apparently have them cut off. President Trump is concerned about their well-being. And he posted a Truth Social this morning where he brought their issue up. He said, "We have very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin with Russia yesterday, and there's a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukraine troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested the President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one of the worst since World War II. God bless them all." And that is consistent with what Trump is, what has been driving him is this horrible loss. And he's always been clear about saying the losses on both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians. He views the war as unwinnable and it shouldn't have been fought. He said many times, had he been president, this war would almost certainly never have started. I happen to agree with that for very practical diplomatic reasons, but it doesn't matter. That it did happen, it is underway, and now he's trying to get the thing over. The previous administration ignored all of those realities and continued to foster the war and to keep it going and to feed it, even though any rational person could have seen that it was unwinnable, yet they were oblivious to the cost to the Ukrainian side. Well, now Trump is not. And in fact, he at a speech yesterday with Mark Rutte from the Oval Office, he emphasized again why he is so focused.
We're going to be discussing a lot of things. Obviously, we'll be discussing what's happening with respect to Ukraine and Russia. At this moment, we have people talking in Russia. We have representatives over there, Steve Witkoff and others, and they're in very serious discussions. As you know, Ukraine has agreed, subject to this, what's happening today, to a complete ceasefire, and we hope Russia will do the same. Thousands of people are being killed, young people, usually, mostly. Young people, we were just talking about it. Thousands of young people are being killed a week, and we want to see that stop. And we have to get this war over with, and you'll be back to a normal, much more normal life. And maybe we're close.
And yeah, he's hoping we're close because in Jeddah last week in Saudi Arabia, Trump got a concession out of the Ukraine side that they were up to that point unwilling to have a full ceasefire. Zelensky had said very plainly he doesn't want a ceasefire on the ground. I never completely understood the logic. He wanted one on the sky and to see which were the areas both of biggest control to him, but he's losing territory on the ground and troops on the ground. So I wasn't clear why it would ever be in his interest to not have the ground included, but Trump got it out of him. And after that meeting, Zelensky himself acknowledged and said, yes, we'll go and agree to a full 30-day ceasefire. Now we have to go to the other half of the equation, and that is on the Russian side. So the question is, what is Russia's motivation? Now, as we've been telling you for a long time, for months, because this idea has been out there for a long time that the war at some point is going to have to end in a negotiated settlement. The question has always been, will it start with a ceasefire and then have negotiations where no one's being killed, or will there be negotiations during the fighting, and then once they agree to something, then it would be stopped? Well, it was very clear what the Ukraine side would have preferred. And again, the Biden administration didn't even broach the subject. But since Trump has been in, he obviously wants a ceasefire to stop the killing first. But now Russia is playing a little bit of hardball here, and they're maintaining the consistency because up to this point, they have categorically said there won't be. In fact, it was as recently as 3 weeks ago, one of the Russian senior officials said that we will not have a ceasefire. You've seen me put from December where Sergei Lavrov said a truce is a road to nowhere. We're not going to do it. We'll talk, we'll negotiate, we'll continue to work on the details, but we'll not stop. Well, that seemed to have a bit of a subtle change when Vladimir Putin initially said, I'm open to the idea. I'm considering it, but there's some caveats that go with it. There's some nuance was a word he used, which I think is not quite the right translation or definitions are in order here, because the concessions that he's talking about are a little more than nuance. They're actually quite considerate. Well, Trump was asked just at an interview last night what he would do if there isn't a ceasefire.
What's the plan if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire?
Bad news for this world because so many people are dying, but I think he's going to agree.
And believe me, nobody wishes that more than I do, and I hope that he's able to do it. There obviously are things that we don't know that are going on behind the scenes. As I mentioned in a show yesterday, there are some potential sweeteners that Trump could put on the table. He does have some leverage. He does have some cards to play, but he doesn't have the power cards, which the Russian side does have. And to kind of give an example of just how Putin himself is thinking, he said this at an interview. I think it was the day before yesterday.
Then the question arises: how will issues of control and verification be resolved? How can we be assured, and how will it be guaranteed to us that nothing like this will take place? How will control be organized? I hope that, at the level of common sense, this is clear to everyone. These are all serious questions. And who will be giving the orders to cease hostilities? And what is the value of these orders? Just imagine almost 2,000 kilometers. Who will determine where and by whom a possible ceasefire agreement has been violated along these 2,000 kilometers? And then, who will be blaming whom for violating this agreement? These are all questions that require thorough examination from both sides. Therefore, the idea itself is correct, and we certainly support it, but there are questions that we need to discuss.
Now, so he again reiterates, I'm open to it, I'm willing to discuss it, but there are some questions. Now, there's a little background. Some of the things, actually many of the things he mentioned in there are actually because of from the Russian perspective, bad experience from the Minsk agreements back in 2015. Because in those cases, some of those issues were not resolved. They had a ceasefire first, and then they were working on negotiating details. And a lot of those things were left off the table, so they didn't get them answered. And now then Russia is saying up front that, okay, before we even agree to a ceasefire, we're going to have these big issues resolved here first. And a few of them are, as you heard him saying there at the beginning of that clip, he's looking for guarantees. The Russian side says before we'll agree to a ceasefire, we have to have some kind of guarantees that this is going to go in a direction that we want. Some of the specific issues there are who is going to be controlling the organization of these things. So there has to be some sort of infrastructure, some sort of bureaucracy that's agreed to by all parties that's going to monitor this. It's going to control it. He said, this just front from the Kursk area and now probably the Sumi area. It's very soon. It's not going to be Kursk anymore because that's going to be reestablished, and the front's now going to be, as in parts it already is, in the Sumi Oblast of Ukraine. So from the Ukraine front all the way around to the Kherson area down in the south, he says it's about a 2,000-kilometer front. So he says that's a big area to monitor, and he says who's going to be monitoring that? And then who's going to be responsible for violations? That's one of the big issues that they had that was omitted from the Minsk agreements, is that there was no penalties for violations. And the OSCE was involved in that one. They were monitoring a lot of this stuff, and they would announce when there had been ceasefire violations, but there was no enforcement mechanism really for either side. And there were violations going back and forth. Later in this process, in the early part of 2022, actually before Russia invaded, the violations on the Ukraine side went sky high and went through the roof on artillery violations, which not many in the West actually want to talk about anymore, but the information is still out there on the web. You can certainly Google that, the artillery violations by the OSCE that were monitored at that time. But it doesn't matter if you accept that or not, Russia believes it. And the fact is they aren't going to agree to a ceasefire unless they can get those issues resolved and get them issues resolved in ways they like. Now, we need to understand right now, that's not something that's going to happen quickly. And the fact that Steve Witkoff, who flew to Moscow and stayed less than 24 hours and came back without making a statement, is pretty strong evidence that we're not that close to an agreement. Because I can only imagine that behind the scenes, the Russians are probably asking maybe even more than that, or saying, hey, we have some pretty high standards here that the U.S. side so far is not willing to acknowledge, because that's going to be some pretty big asks. And to give in to everything Russia is asking for is going to make the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side look weak. And Trump doesn't like to look weak. So he's trying to find some way to get this done where some of his leverage can work. So that's why I'm sure that behind the scenes, he's not saying anything against this. Trump isn't. I would imagine that he's probably trying to find some sweeteners that would not be unpalatable or too unpalatable for many in the West, but that might be enough for Putin to say, all right, we can live with that as long as A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z, whatever all his other terms are. I think it's going to be a very, very high hurdle to clear. And I have doubts that the Russian side even want to have a ceasefire, despite what Putin's saying. I think there's more and more evidence growing that they don't want one. One of the issues on the table that Putin just mentioned there was who's going to monitor the ceasefire violations, who's going to monitor this 2,000-kilometer front. Well, one group seems to think, hey, I could do that. I know who that is, and that is the European Union Plus, this coalition of the willing. At the moment, there are 37 members of that, and they're going to be meeting in, I think it's Paris tomorrow. So they're saying, hey, we'll do that. We'll meet with that, and we'll provide and I've mentioned this before, some of the comments coming out of the European side is we'll have a robust peace enforcement force. So they won't just be peacekeepers with blue helmets and rifles, but they'll have full military kit to enforce whatever peace. Now, I'm sure that on the surface, they would say, yes, that'll extend to both sides. We'll patrol this 2,000-kilometer front. And if Russia violates it, we'll do something to them. And if Ukraine violates it, we'll do something to them. Not thinking that's going to work out too well. And in fact, if anybody has any doubts about it, definitely don't take my word. But how about the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov?
If NATO expansion is recognized, at least by Donald Trump, as one of the root causes, then the presence of the troops from NATO countries under any flag in any capacity on Ukrainian soil is the same threat.
You won't accept it under any conditions?
Under any conditions, well, nobody is talking to us. They keep saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but they do everything about Russia without Russia.
So He's saying unequivocally, anybody who has a NATO patch on their shoulder, any country from or any soldier from a country that wears a NATO patch under whatever flag, under whatever patch, if that troop is from a NATO country, he said they're disqualified. So they're not going to agree to that. Maybe they would agree to something with the OSCE, somebody who's not a member of NATO, maybe some other country. So even categorically, they're not necessarily opposed to any kind of peacekeeping forces or enforcement mechanism of some sort, but that's only going to be on the line that they prefer. And by the way, this related to something we said at the top, where Trump is saying, hey, I want you guys to not kill these people. This just popped on my phone, like during that clip that was played there on Telegram by Dmitry Medvedev from the National Security Council in Russia. He says, moments ago at a meeting of the permanent members of the Russian Security Council, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief said, if the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region lay down their arms and surrender, we will guarantee them their lives and dignified treatment. This is a very humane approach by our country, but for the Ukrainian Nazis, there is also a flip side. Should they refuse to lay down their arms, they will be systematically and mercilessly eliminated. The bloodthirsty Kiev regime still has a chance to save its people. In the coming hours, we will see what they have chosen. So, on the plus side there, President Trump's plea has been answered. The Russian side is saying, we're willing to do that. We're willing to do what you've asked as long as they lay down their arms and surrender. And listen, folks, if I was a Ukraine soldier, that's exactly what I would do. That's not empty bluster, because they have them in the pocket right now. They can make good on this right here, and they can move through and systematically destroy them all. They basically got them cut off, not just under fire control, but apparently something close to being physically encircled in a pocket inside the Kursk area. So kudos for President Trump, because his diplomacy there is reaping some opportunities. Now, it just remains to be seen whether the Ukraine side will accept that deal and will follow through with something to keep their people alive. And that's a theme that I've seen a lot, and I have worries that they won't do it. I really hope to be proven wrong on that, because that's one of the motivations of President Trump, and apparently the Russians are willing to concede to that. Any possibility of getting even small-scale things like this, an agreement that turns into something that's positive, that moves towards peace and keeps people alive, we need to seize it, because every positive thing has the possibility to build to the next positive thing. But if those things are rejected and thrown away, then we go backwards. And now then the position's hardened, because what's really important to understand in all of this, Russia is in the military, economic, and production capacity pro side. They're in the advantage, irrevocable advantage. So that's important when you're understanding who can do, because if Trump wants this and tries to push hard for this, but he doesn't have the leverage to compel it, and the Russians can have the ability to say yes, or they have the power to compel no, and that they can go down another path, and there's not power to compel a stop on the other side, you see where this is likely to go. That's just the history of armed negotiations going back millennia. It doesn't matter whether the Spartans back in the thousands of years ago or these people here today that are, like right now, the fundamentals, the human fundamentals, the military fundamentals have not changed in that regard. Now, I want to look at one of the other things here, because that was the issue. One of the peacekeepers. That's a big one, because the European Union is putting a lot of effort to get his 37-member alliance that has almost no chance of actually going in there, but they're going down it anyway, thinking that somehow, I don't know, that Russia's going to agree to something that's not to their advantage when they have the power to prevent it. But there's another issue, that some people want the current line of contact to be the end, or they say maybe even the June 14 lines. I think that there's certainly an element in the Trump camp that says, look, those administrative borders of those 4 regions, big chunks of them, especially the southern 3, are still in Ukrainian control. And to have an agreement, Ukraine is going to have to be willing to abandon that, to withdraw back to those administrative borders. That's going to be a tough ask. But here's the problem. Even at those administrative borders, that doesn't change all of the dynamics for the Russians, because there are demographically a whole bunch of other ethnic Russians still on the other side of even those administrative borders. And Sergei Lavrov gave notice that has not passed their notice.
And the second thing is the rights and the fate of the people who live not only on the liberated territories, but on the territories under the control of the regime. They also, most of them, speak Russian. They were brought as part of the Russian culture, and they want their kids to know Russian and to learn Russian. My question was whether this law, or several pieces of law, prohibiting Russian language, whether this would be cancelled on the territory which would be left of Ukraine. There is no answer. We'll see later.
Now, one of the things when he says these several laws, what he's referring to is in the run up to the February 2022 war, and in the months. So into 2021, Ukraine started changing their laws, which obviously violated the spirit of the Minsk agreements themselves and moved further away from it, even at that time, where they systematically stripped the rights of the Russian-speaking citizens inside the country. They denied them rights. They denied them the ability to speak their own language in any official capacity. They couldn't read and write in school, etc., and other places as well. So these were systematically repressing the Russian population, which was one of the reasons cited by the Russians as to why they intervened in the first place. That was one of the big ones. So now Lavrov is saying we're still paying attention to that. And so he says, yeah, there's the June 14 lines, but even on the other side of the June 14 lines, there is a large number of Russians. Now, you may recall that a couple of weeks back, I think we had Austrian Colonel Mark Reisner, who showed that one of the possible ends, if there's no ceasefire, was that the Russians could go all the way through the Dnieper River and even southern part of that to take all of the area up to the Moldovan area and the Transnistria area, which would include Odessa, because there was a lot of ethnic Russians living in that area. So that's been a key point to Russia, not ever far from their eyes, even though it's never on our radar at all. But so that leads to the question, will Russia be satisfied with this if they don't get those changes? Sergei Lavrov said, are they going to change their order, their constitution, which was also part of the aborted Istanbul agreements in 2022, and the big part, the number one part of the Minsk agreements that were never accomplished by the Ukrainian side, they were obligated to change their constitution to get rid of those things and give limited autonomy to the Russian speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine. That never happened. Since that time, since the war started, there's even bigger constraints on them. So here's the question. If Russia doesn't see that the Ukraine side is willing, it's part of a ceasefire negotiations even, and certainly as part of a negotiated settlement, that they would change their constitution and give the rights back to the Russian speakers on their side of the line, one has to wonder what would happen next. Now, to get an idea of whether the Ukraine side is aware of this and what they're thinking, we don't have to wonder. One of their members of parliament said this a few days ago.
In my personal view, there are three things. First is our territorial integrity de jure, meaning that occupied territories, Ukrainian territories by Russians, yes, they will be controlled by Russians after the end of hostilities, at least part of them, but they are Ukrainian territories. That is very important for us to keep this non-recognition policy, because one day the last colonial empire in Europe will fall apart, speaking about Russia, and Ukraine will regain control over territories. Number two is sovereignty, meaning that Ukraine makes its own choices about what army to have, what military production to expand, and what alliances to join. This is very important. Number three is security guarantees, meaning that, first of all, definitely from European Union and European countries, meaning what will prevent Russia from attacking again. So these are three things. Again, territorial integrity de jure, sovereignty, and security guarantees, which I think should be our red lines.
Yeah, your red lines. So you're telling Russia pretty straightforward, we're not going to change our laws. We're not going to change our constitution. We're not even going to give away our territory. We're going to stay with, we may allow you to control them for a time, but only with the caveat that we are going to get them back through diplomacy later. And by the way, we're going to maintain the ability to have alliances, straight up alliances, not neutrality, but we will decide whether we want to have alliances the fourth, and then we're going to get security guarantees from the West. Categorically, Russia refused all of those things, and one could make the argument that all three of those things were some of the big drivers for why Russia started the war in the first place. So even after now into the fourth year of war, where everything has gone against the Ukraine side, where they've lost probably north of 1 million soldiers, continue to lose them by the thousands every week, there is no prospect that the U.S. is going to continue supporting this war. On what rational basis should anyone in the Ukrainian government be making red line declarations to the side that has been winning this war and has the capacity to completely destroy itself, the other country? There is no one. Trump has been emphatic that he's not going to compel by force of arms or anything else Russia to do this. They may put some more sanctions on. They may turn even more support on later. I doubt that, but that's at least a possibility. But you've seen that with no holds barred, all the support from the U.S. and the European side has not stopped the loss of the Ukraine side. So by any rational estimation and analysis, the Ukraine side can see that with even marginal support from the U.S. and much less none, there is no hope. So then why then would you want to tell Russia, when they are signaling clearly they're looking beyond the 14 June lines, that you're not going to do the one thing that could prevent Russia from doing that? If the Ukraine side agreed to that, and if that was part of even a ceasefire negotiation, guarantees up front that Russia's looking for, it could be that even at this late hour, that Russia could be satisfied with only going to the 14 June lines. But if they don't get that assurances, I think that it's likely, not even possible, but likely, that Russia will militarily go beyond that. And a signal was sent just the other day with an apparent leaked document that was discussed on Fox News by Rebecca Koffler, who we've had on our show before here. She's written the book, I think, The Putin Playbook, has dedicated most of her life to understanding how the Russians think. And here's what she said yesterday on Fox News.
But there was also a leaked document, Rebecca, showing Russia's plan is to prolong this war for years, past 2026. Russia, of course, denies that. Do you believe that ultimately what's in that plan is their plan?
99.9%. I mean, remember, in Putin's playbook, my book, I laid out very clearly what Putin's playbook is, his strategy, which is a multi-pronged strategy that he spent a quarter of a century developing. Okay. And we remember 3 years ago, we were here on the show and you asked me, Todd, how do we stop Putin's playbook? And what was my answer? I said, it was almost impossible. Why? Because I know that we don't have a counter strategy. Every single war game that we conducted back in the intelligence community ended up in Russia winning the war. And neither us nor the Europeans never bothered to develop a counter strategy, even though 10 years prior to the invasion, we knew about it.
So there's Rebecca Koffler talking. She used to work in the CIA, by the way. Some of those war games she was talking about were no kidding actual conducted. And you heard her say it. They all came out with the Russians on top. Now then Russia's even stronger than when those war games were crafted, because those were done in a dynamic before this war started, when Russia was at its position where it was heading into February 2022. Now then they're substantially stronger in every category. So again, any kind of rational analysis would say, why would Russia agree to terms to its disadvantage when it has the power to compel compliance? That is at the heart of this whole issue right here. Now, you may say, that's Rebecca Koffler. That's just somebody from this side of the pond, and they're reading articles or whatever, and that's their conclusion. Okay, they used to work at the CIA, but still, that was a long time ago. But that's not the case right now. And Russia, I think, is hurting bad. I keep hearing this. Russia's hurting bad. Their economy's on the brink. Their military is at the point of exhaustion. They just can't go on much further. So they need an end to this war. Well, if you don't want to believe Rebecca Koffler, maybe you'll listen to a very prominent and former direct confidant, still confidant to both Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin, used to be a Kremlin advisor, who said this on BBC.
I just want to check what the aim of Russia is here. Is the aim to come to some kind of deal on Ukraine, or is the aim to ensure the capitulation of Kiev?
First of all, I mean, the best possible outcome is, of course, total capitulation of Europe, of Ukraine and Europe. We have to finish this war one way or another. And I hope that what was left of Ukraine would be totally demilitarized and neutralized and live in peace. I mean, they could be and not used as a spearhead against Russia. If not, if it would be used, I mean, the war would resume.
So you see him point blank. This war has to be concluded to Russia's advantage. They are said, he even said there, and he paused for dramatic effect. He said, our best case scenario is the total capitulation of Ukraine and Europe. At first he had he said Europe and meant Ukraine, but then he stopped and added back in Europe. So his point is there is certainly not going to be any armed European peacekeepers inside Ukraine, ergo on the Russian border with wherever the dividing line is going to end up. That's not even on the possible list of things that the Russians would agree to. But you can see that Karaganov here, without blinking, without hesitation, without embarrassment, our objective is to see the complete capitulation of Ukraine and the defeat of Europe. Now, it's unclear whether he means the political defeat or he means a military defeat. I think it's pretty clear that Russia does not want to go to war with the European Union. But more and more we're seeing the possibility, especially as Europe has this big rearm program that they're going to have, adding $800 billion to their defense industry up through 2030. Everybody from Germany to the Baltics to several other countries that have been warning their people, we're getting ready for war with Russia. There's every incentive for Russia not to agree to any kind of end of negotiation settlements, much less a ceasefire per se, that will leave it in anything except the strongest possible position. So you have Vladimir Putin saying that conceptually, I'm willing to have a ceasefire. And I think that he means that. I do. But the conditions that he laid out there, and especially when you get into the denazification and the demilitarization, which have not left their lexicon, that's not off the table. You see that for them to have a ceasefire, they're saying as long as you meet all of our conditions, which I think in this point is right from the Volodymyr Zelensky, who said Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. He just wants the surrender of the Ukraine side. That's what he has said. And I think I have to agree with him here. I think that is what Putin is asking for. So the difficulty for the White House is going to be, if you're trying to get a ceasefire to end the war here and you want it on terms favorable to Kiev, that's not likely to succeed. So the question is going to be, what's going to happen next? Where is this going to end up going? And right now, I don't have an answer to that. And it's unclear, how this can play out any way other than what the Russians are saying that they want, because they have the power to make it happen. We're going to have to wait and see. Again, there's things going on behind the scenes I don't know about. Diplomatic things between the United States and Russia I don't know about. Hopefully Trump has some cards that we're not aware of that can make this end in some other way less than that. But the big thing is this needs to end, and it needs to end quickly, because the longer it drags on, the worse it's going to be for Ukraine and the worse it's going to be for Western interests. So in this case, even a bad deal for the West, it ends the war, is probably the best we're going to get right now, and something I would advocate. We'll see how it works out. You can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to stay with you on top of it, and we'll keep you updated as things continue to happen, like we did with this one from
Donald Trump wants to build an Iron Dome for America. He made the announcement during his address to Congress last week. Watch.
First step, I'm asking Congress to fund a state-of-the-art Golden Dome missile defense shield to protect our homeland, all made in the USA.
Okay. So notice all the clapping. Mike Johnson, yes, absolutely. So immediately I smelled a rat, and I called it out live during that broadcast while we were on the air. I smelled a rat. So let me explain why I smelled a rat. For that, we need some context in Israel, okay? In recent years, Israel's Iron Dome has been portrayed as a near invincible missile defense system. It intercepts and neutralizes incoming rocket threats with pinpoint accuracy. Nothing can get by it, like Martin Brodeur, the New Jersey Devils. He can stop everything, just like the Iron Dome. Like Brodeur from the New Jersey Devils, you couldn't get anything by that guy, just like the Israeli Iron Dome. So just so you understand, when we talk about the Iron Dome in Israel, we're talking about a project that was funded almost entirely by the United States. Did you know that? Billions. The U.S. has spent billions funding Israel's Iron Dome. And now President Trump wants to replicate this dome and build what he called a golden dome here in America, a missile shield over the United States. However, a closer look at this reveals that the Iron Dome is neither as effective nor as impenetrable as its proponents claim. And frankly, nothing like Brodeur at all. The reality is that Israel's missile defense system struggles against high-volume attacks. Being overwhelmed when more than a few rockets are fired at once, it can't handle it. It's economically unsustainable, as I'll show you in a minute, on top of that. And most critically of all, and most importantly of all to my view, it's completely useless against modern hypersonic missile threats. In other words, it doesn't work. So let's throw a whole bunch of money at it, right? So if you need evidence of this, Iran's recent successful use of hypersonic missiles against Israel put that on full display and truly exposed this vulnerability on a global stage, all over CNN, all over Fox News, for all the world to see. So despite these obvious failures, President Trump's push for an American Iron Dome is nothing more than a massive boondoggle, a massive giveaway to the defense industry. A big wet kiss for the military-industrial complex, something we've railed against here on this show for years. They already have $1 trillion that we hand them, helped in part, of course, by Biden's swarming of drones over the mid-Atlantic after the election. Remember that? After the election, and suddenly there were drones all over America, and we couldn't stop it? What are these drones? We need an Iron Dome, of course, to protect us, to shoot them down, to protect our military bases. Why are all these drones up all over the sky? Of course, we now know those drones were U.S. drones being used as a false flag operation to scare us. Remember this guy, Jeff Van Drew? He said it's Iran, and he heard that it was an Iranian mothership out there.
Well, here's the real deal, Harris. You know, I'm also on the Transportation Committee, on the Aviation Subcommittee, and I've gotten to know people. And from very high sources, very qualified sources, very responsible sources, I'm going to tell you the real deal. Iran launched a mothership probably about a month ago that contains these drones. That mothership is off, I'm going to tell you the deal. It's off the east coast of the United States of America. They've launched drones, is everything that we can see or hear. And again, these are from high sources. I don't say this lightly. Now, you know, we know there was a probability. It could have been.
So it's an Iranian mothership launching these drones. Quick, let's build an Iron Dome and spend $1 trillion doing it so we can protect ourselves against the Iranian mothership. Well, we now know.
I think when we, as I say, when we first ran that clip, I'm pretty sure I sprained my optical nerves from eye rolls because I was like, is that guy seriously saying that, like the Iranian mothership?
They think we're
I'll never
stupid.
get over that.
But there's so many people that were watching it, and you know, they were just sitting there watching Fox News that afternoon. They're like, "Oh my God, it's Iran! Yeah, you know what? Those Iranians, we better go to war with them. We better build an Iron Dome. Yep, we better do it." False flag, just like the Iranians that wanted to kill Trump. That's been totally debunked. People still believe that canard. Even Roger Stone, Trump's friend, immediately was like, "It's not Iran. That's a false flag. Don't fall for it." We said that right here on the show. Don't fall for it. They want us to go to war with Iran. So anyway, we need to build an Iron Dome. So let's break this down a little bit further here. And I hope that maybe you'll share this video with people. And so anyone who's supporting an Iron Dome project, we're going to actually present you with details and research here. So here's how the Iron Dome is supposed to work. It's short-range missile defense system. It's designed to intercept rockets and artillery shells before they reach populated areas. Developed by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in partnership with United States defense giant Raytheon, of course. The man in Israel who headed up this project is Brigadier General Daniel Gold. He's considered a national hero. If you speak to Israelis about this, they'll talk about, there he is in purple in the center of your screen there. He's like a national hero. Here he is. He was the head of Israel's Ministry of Defense Research and Development Directorate when he initiated this project. The system consists of 3 key elements and components. Detection and tracking radar system. So it detects incoming threats, predicts their trajectory, knows where they're going to go, and then it doesn't. But by the way, it doesn't track hypersonic missiles coming in. It only will track those small arms that are coming in because hypersonics are way too fast. Then it uses battle management and weapon control system. So it processes that radar data and decides whether or not to launch a interceptor missile. Okay, it's coming in too fast. We can't do anything about it, so we can't do anything about it. Oh, it's coming in slowly? Sure, all right, let's launch something to intercept this thing. And then third, it uses Tamir missiles to intercept and destroy incoming rockets. Here's where it falls apart, though, of course, because each Tamir interceptor costs $40,000 up to $100,000. Each one of them. Each one of those that you just saw launching there, up to $100,000. And the small surface-to-air missiles it's meant to knock down, coming from Hamas or Hezbollah, could cost as little as $300. So you're knocking a $300 thing out of the air with a $100,000 thing. Economics don't really work here. That means that unless American taxpayers are willing to pay for this system, it doesn't make it financially stable at all. But American taxpayers, you guys have been more than generous. Billions of dollars to Israel to support their Iron Dome project. So I'm sure you're fine with that. Totally fine with that. The Iron Dome in Israel has long been touted by CNN and Fox News as a game changer. You know, anytime there's been like live coverage of an event, they're like, they've activated their Iron Dome and it's been phenomenal. Of course, the reality is that its effectiveness is highly questionable. Wikipedia, which is one of the worst websites in the world, like if you want to get accurate information, Wikipedia is a massive purveyor of misinformation. It claims that the Iron Dome boasts a 90% interception rate. Of course, their source for that information are Israeli media sources for those numbers. But independent analysts say that number is laughable. 90% is a joke. Theodore Postel, MIT physicist who's studied this at length, says that the Iron Dome interceptions are likely far lower, possibly as low as 5 to 10%. Many intercepted rockets are not actually destroyed, but they actually just continue on their trajectory, often striking populated areas. And even Israel itself, even Israeli defense officials have admitted that the system doesn't really work as it's advertised. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ahrens even admitted that the Iron Dome's effectiveness is often exaggerated. That's right out of Israel. In other words, propaganda. The main problem is that the Iron Dome simply can be just overwhelmed with missiles. For example, during Operation Guardian of the Walls in 2021, Hamas launched over 4,000 rockets, and the Iron Dome failed to stop most of them. Similarly, Hezbollah has upgraded its arsenal with precision-guided munitions, and the Iron Dome can't stop them, as we've detailed on the show over the past few years. But the biggest problem with the Iron Dome is that it's completely useless against modern hypersonic missiles, which Iran, Russia, and China have, and which the United States and Israel do not. Hypersonic missiles are the Iron Dome's worst nightmare. You can't stop them at all. as we saw when Iran devastated airfields, military targets all over Israel, and the Iron Dome didn't do crap. The Iron Dome was powerless to stop them. Explosion after explosion, wiping out military airfields. Worst of all, these hypersonic missiles actually destroyed Iron Dome batteries themselves. The very launch sites for the Iron Dome were destroyed by these hypersonic missiles. And to launch these interceptor rockets, they couldn't do it. And the Iron Dome couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Just so you understand, hypersonic missiles travel at speeds greater than Mach 5, 3,836 miles an hour, and are highly maneuverable the whole time, making them basically invisible to existing defense systems, including the Iron Dome itself. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which follow a predictable arc, hypersonic missiles can change direction mid-flight, making interception nearly impossible. They can't do it. So it raises serious concerns about the feasibility of an Iron Dome-like system in the United States. What are we protecting against? Exactly. If not hypersonic missiles, we keep hearing that those are our biggest threat from Russia and China and Iran. What? What then? Like Mexican cartels with shoulder-fired rockets? Like that's what we're going to build an Iron Dome for? Okay. So President Trump has proposed an American Iron Dome, arguing that the U.S. needs a missile defense shield to protect against threats from China, Russia, and other adversaries. However, this plan is a boondoggle for the defense industry for several reasons. The Iron Dome was designed for short-range rockets, but the United States would need to defend against long-range ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons, cruise missiles, which the Iron Dome is incapable of stopping. To do all that would cost close to $1 trillion or hundreds of billions of dollars at the minimum. But, you know, when you look at like, are they going to have budget overruns or not? They always have budget overruns. Do they ever come in under budget in the defense industry in the United States? No. I mean, look at the F-35 program. Look at the Osprey program. Look at all of them. They're always over budget, and then you end up paying for it. This plan is not about security. It's about funneling your money, taxpayer dollars, into the pockets of military corporations. Bottom line. Oh, and by the way, don't fall for the propaganda, because the United States, by the way, already has missile defense systems. The U.S. already operates far more advanced operating systems than the Iron Dome, including the THAAD system, which is the Thermal High Altitude Area Defense, the Aegis system against ballistic missiles, the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, the GMD system. And by the way, they're also working right now on the GPI system, the Glide system. None of these systems, however, can reliably stop hypersonic missiles. And they are far more advanced than the Iron Dome system. You see what this is? It's a madness. So when Trump just gets up there and says this and people applaud, they don't understand the details of it at all. In other words, there's nothing the United States can do to stop hypersonic missiles that could be deployed at scale across the United States in some kind of massive dome idea, some sort of golden dome. It's a lie. It won't work. So either Trump is being misled. I like to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt, because I know during his first administration, he was surrounded by neocons that kept him doing certain things like funneling javelins off to Ukraine and other things like that. So it's either one of two things. President Trump is being misled here by neocons in Washington that desperately want trillions of dollars being spent on a boondoggle of an Iron Dome project. Or he's lying. He knows it's a boondoggle and he's lying to you. I tend to believe that he's being misled. I don't think he knows the truth on this, personally. Maybe I'm just giving him the benefit of the doubt. Where do you guys come down on this? You think he knows about this? And by the way, just can we talk some numbers?
Go figure. Follow me.